The Rise of England, from Island Kingdom to Colonial Power. The story of England's transformation from a small insular kingdom into a vast colonial empire is one of ambition, adaptation, and enduring influence. Situated on the periphery of continental Europe, England was for much of its early history a modest power, grappling with internal strife, foreign invasions, and dynastic uncertainty. Yet, over the course of centuries, a combination of military strength, political cunning, maritime innovation, and economic enterprise propelled the island nation onto the world stage. By the dawn of the modern age, England had not only asserted dominance over its neighbors, but had also laid the foundation for a global empire whose legacy continues to shape the modern world. England's early formation was marked by fragmentation. Following the withdrawal of Roman forces in the 5th century, the island saw waves of migration and invasion, including the Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and later the Normans in 1066. These arrivals did not merely displace existing populations, but gradually amalgamated various cultures, languages, and governance systems. The Norman conquest, in particular, brought about a significant shift in England's political and administrative structure. With strong ties to continental Europe and a centralized feudal system, the Normans established a stable monarchy, creating a platform upon which future English rulers could consolidate power. Throughout the Middle Ages, England was embroiled in a series of conflicts, both internal and external, that gradually shaped its national identity and expanded its influence. The 100 Years' War against France, though marked by intermittent defeats, cultivated a sense of military resilience and national unity. The war also stimulated the development of a professional army and introduced new tactics and technologies, such as the longbow, which would be emblematic of English martial prowess. Equally important was the internal political evolution. The signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 curtailed absolute royal authority and sowed the seeds of constitutional governance, an idea that would later distinguish England from many of its European counterparts. The late medieval period also witnessed growing economic dynamism. The wool trade, in particular, generated substantial wealth, fueling the rise of merchant classes and urban centers. This burgeoning economic power began to influence politics, gradually shifting the balance of authority away from the monarchy and toward parliamentary institutions. As commerce flourished, so too did the appetite for exploration and overseas opportunity. By the 15th century, inspired in part by the maritime ventures of neighboring Portugal and Spain, English navigators began to seek their own fortunes beyond the confines of Europe. The Tudor dynasty marked a turning point in England's ascent. Henry VII stabilized the realm after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, and his son Henry VIII further centralized authority by breaking with the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England. This move not only consolidated royal power, but also positioned England as a distinct religious and political entity in opposition to Catholic Europe. Under Elizabeth I, this new identity coalesced into a confident national outlook. Her reign, often referred to as the Elizabethan Golden Age, witnessed a flowering of the arts, the rise of a powerful navy, and the first tentative steps toward overseas colonization. English privateers, operating with royal approval, harassed Spanish shipping and brought back wealth from the New World, signaling England's entry into the contest for colonial dominance. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh became national heroes, not only for their daring exploits, but also for symbolizing England's emerging global ambitions. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 further emboldened this sense of destiny, establishing England as a formidable naval power capable of challenging the mightiest empires of the day. The 17th century was an era of profound transformation. The English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the interlude of Republican rule under Oliver Cromwell reflected deep tensions over governance, religion, and the limits of royal authority. These events, while destabilizing in the short term, ultimately strengthened parliamentary power and paved the way for a constitutional monarchy. Meanwhile, overseas ventures continued apace. English settlers established footholds in North America, the Caribbean, and along the African coast. The formation of trading companies, such as the East India Company, laid the groundwork for commercial and later territorial domination in Asia. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 and the subsequent Glorious Revolution of 1688 further cemented England's unique political evolution. With Parliament asserting its supremacy over the Crown, the country enjoyed a period of relative political stability and growing prosperity. This internal consolidation allowed England to expand its overseas reach with renewed vigor. Colonies multiplied, trade networks grew more complex, and the Royal Navy became the instrument through which England projected its power across the seas. The 18th century saw England transformed into the heart of an empire. The union with Scotland in 1707 created Great Britain, enabling the kingdom to marshal greater resources and talent in pursuit of imperial ambition. Wars with France, both in Europe and overseas, were waged not only for political supremacy but also for control over colonies and trade routes. Victories in these conflicts, particularly the 7 Years' War, secured British dominance in North America and India. As the British Empire took shape, England reaped the economic benefits of its expanding dominion, becoming a hub of global trade and finance. Yet the story of England's rise is not solely one of conquest and wealth. The nation's global footprint was accompanied by moral, cultural, and political challenges. The transatlantic slave trade, in which English merchants played a central role, enriched the empire at an immense human cost. Debates over the morality of empire, the responsibilities of rulers, and the rights of colonized peoples became more pronounced, especially as Enlightenment ideas took root. At home, England grappled with industrialization, urbanization, and shifting social structures, all of which were influenced by, and in turn influenced its role as a colonial power. Despite the loss of the American colonies in the late 18th century, England's imperial drive did not falter. Attention shifted to Asia and Africa, where new territories offered fresh resources and markets. Technological advances, including steamships and the telegraph, enabled tighter control over distant colonies. Missionary efforts, too, expanded alongside commerce and military campaigns, as English ideals were exported to, and often imposed upon, indigenous populations. This era also witnessed the rise of the British identity, blending English traditions with those of other constituent nations within the United Kingdom, all under the banner of imperial unity. Throughout this journey, England's transformation was never linear or uncontested. Challenges came not only from rival empires, but also from within. Rebellions, economic crises, and political scandals periodically disrupted progress. Nevertheless, the underlying momentum endured. The English language spread around the world, along with legal systems, educational models, and political concepts. England's influence, forged through centuries of struggle, innovation, and adaptation, extended far beyond its modest geographic boundaries. By the early 19th century, England stood at the center of a global empire upon which the sun famously never set. Its navy ruled the seas, its merchants controlled vast flows of goods and capital, and its institutions served as models for aspiring modern states. Though this global prominence would evolve and be challenged in the centuries to come, the foundations laid during this transformative period continued to shape global history. The rise of England from a fragmented island kingdom to a commanding colonial power is a testament to its resilience, strategic foresight, and unrelenting ambition. It is a story that encompasses not only kings and conquests, but also the everyday labor of sailors, traders, builders, and thinkers who carried English influence far beyond its shores. It is a history marked by both triumphs and tragedies, glory and contradiction, but one that undeniably altered the course of the modern world. The East India Company, commerce, conquest, and corruption. The East India Company began not as a conquering force, but as a venture of commerce shaped by the ambitions of English merchants who sought to tap into the immense wealth of the East. Founded in 1600 through a royal charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I, the company was initially a joint stock trading corporation, a relatively new concept in the realm of European economics. The charter granted it exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies, which loosely referred to South and Southeast Asia. With its eyes set on the riches of spices, silks, cotton, tea, and other exotic goods, the company's early years were marked by fierce competition with rival European powers, notably the Portuguese and the Dutch, both of whom had already established strongholds in the region. Unable to challenge the Portuguese and Dutch naval dominance directly, the English East India Company opted for a different strategy. It pursued alliances and treaties with local rulers, setting up factories, trading posts that were fortified and often came with military presence. These outposts were not just centers for commerce, they slowly became the seeds of colonial infrastructure. In India, the company's most fruitful endeavors began in Surat, a port on the western coast, and gradually extended to the eastern port of Madras, followed by Bombay and Calcutta. The British Crown, still relatively distant from direct involvement, allowed the company broad autonomy in how it conducted its business and governed its territories. Over time, this autonomy created a powerful entity that operated somewhere between a corporation and a sovereign state. By the 18th century, the East India Company had transformed dramatically. No longer just a trading body, it had acquired administrative and military powers. This transition was fueled by the decline of the Mughal Empire, which had once unified much of the Indian subcontinent under a single rule. As the Mughals weakened due to internal divisions, succession disputes, and growing regional autonomy, the company took advantage of the power vacuum. Through a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and force, it began to influence local politics, often pitting Indian rulers against each other to further its own interests. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked a major turning point. In this conflict, the company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. The victory allowed the company to effectively control the wealthy province of Bengal, including the right to collect land revenues, thereby transitioning from trader to ruler. The consequences of this transformation were profound. As the company assumed more governing authority, it also developed its own army, composed largely of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, commanded by British officers. These private armies often acted independently of the British Crown and engaged in wars that further expanded company territory. By the early 19th century, the East India Company ruled over vast swaths of India, exercising control over more people than any European empire at the time. This governance was not always stable or just. The company prioritized profit above all else, leading to exploitative tax policies, monopolization of agriculture, and neglect of the population's welfare. Bengal, once a flourishing region, was devastated by repeated famines, most notoriously the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, during which millions perished while the company continued to extract revenue. Corruption within the company's administration became a mounting concern. Many of the company's officials used their positions to amass personal fortunes, sending enormous sums back to Britain and returning home as wealthy men known as nabobs. This accumulation of wealth stirred both admiration and resentment in England. Political reformers, intellectuals, and even the general public questioned the moral cost of empire building under the guise of trade. The British Parliament, initially detached, began to intervene more directly, culminating in the Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784, both designed to bring the company's administration under more structured oversight. Despite these efforts, the fundamental model of corporate rule remained intact, with commerce and conquest increasingly intertwined. The expansion of British influence in India through the East India Company was not achieved without resistance. There were frequent uprisings, revolts, and battles, both among Indian states and between Indian populations and company forces. Some of the resistance was political, led by rulers and warlords attempting to preserve autonomy, while other acts were spontaneous expressions of rebellion against exploitative policies. The discontent reached a climax in 1857 with the outbreak of what came to be known as the Indian Rebellion, or the First War of Indian Independence. Sparked by grievances among sepoy soldiers, the uprising quickly spread across northern and central India, drawing in civilians, rulers, and entire communities. Though ultimately suppressed, the rebellion shook the foundations of British rule and highlighted the limits of a company wielding imperial power. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the British government decided that corporate rule had run its course. The Government of India Act of 1858 dissolved the East India Company and transferred direct control of India to the British Crown. Thus began the era of the British Raj. The company's administrative machinery, military, and bureaucratic systems were absorbed into the Crown's colonial framework. The company itself, though still in existence as a corporate shell for a few years, had lost its reason for being. It was formally dissolved in 1874, ending a remarkable, often troubling chapter in global history. The legacy of the East India Company is vast and complex. On one hand, it was a pioneering force in global trade, establishing early networks of commerce that spanned continents. Its ventures laid the groundwork for modern corporate practices, international finance, and state capitalism. On the other hand, its story is inseparable from exploitation, cultural erosion, and human suffering. Its pursuit of profit came at enormous cost to the people it ruled, especially in India, where its policies disrupted traditional economies, undermined local industries, and imposed foreign structures of governance. It also set a precedent for colonialism through private enterprise, a model that influenced other European powers and later ventures. Culturally, the company played a contradictory role. While it facilitated the exchange of ideas, art, and knowledge between East and West, it also imposed a hierarchy that devalued indigenous cultures and prioritized European norms. Many of the scholars, artists, and administrators it employed were fascinated by Indian civilization, collecting manuscripts, building museums, and studying local traditions. Yet these efforts often coexisted with policies that marginalized local authority and elevated British interpretations of law, order, and culture. The duality of curiosity and control marked much of the company's presence in India. The architecture of its rule, its courts, armies, and administrative procedures, continued under the British Raj and later influenced the post-colonial state structures of India. The economic systems it established left deep scars, but also modernized aspects of Indian infrastructure, such as railroads, telegraphs, and port cities. These developments, while often executed to serve colonial interests, became part of the broader modernization of the subcontinent. The linguistic and legal systems introduced under company rule also had lasting effects, contributing to the rise of an educated Indian middle class that would later become central to the independence movement. It is also important to recognize that the East India Company was not merely an English project. It became a sprawling institution involving thousands of Indian soldiers, workers, translators, clerks, and even collaborators from local elites who saw opportunities in partnership. This makes the company's legacy one not just of domination, but of entangled histories, of complicity, resistance, adaptation, and transformation. The line between conqueror and collaborator was often blurred, and many Indians participated in shaping, resisting, or surviving the company's rule in complex ways. In examining the East India Company's story, we find ourselves at the intersection of business and empire, where profit-driven motives evolved into political dominion. It is a reminder of how corporations, when left unchecked and empowered by state or royal charters, can become forces of immense influence, capable of shaping the destinies of entire civilizations. The East India Company's rise and fall is not only a tale of British imperial ambition, but also a cautionary episode in the global history of power, wealth, and governance. Its influence echoes in the corporate empires and geopolitical entanglements of the modern world, offering lessons on the responsibilities that come with economic power and the costs borne when that power is used without regard for justice, equity, or humanity. The Raj Begins, British control over India after 1857. The year 1857 marked a pivotal shift in the history of the Indian subcontinent. What began as a mutiny of sepoys in the British East India Company's army soon erupted into a widespread rebellion, known in British records as the Indian Mutiny, and in Indian narratives as the First War of Independence. This event served as the final blow to the East India Company's rule. By 1858, the British Crown formally dissolved the company and assumed direct control over India. Thus began the era known as the British Raj, a period that would redefine India's governance, economy, society, and identity for nearly a century. Following the uprising, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation in 1858 that signaled the beginning of direct imperial rule. This royal declaration was crafted with the intent of presenting a softer, more respectful image of British authority. It promised to respect Indian customs, religions, and laws, while stressing the importance of justice and equal treatment under the new administration. However, Beneath the surface, the shift in power was more than symbolic. It was structural. The governance of India moved from a corporate entity driven by profit to a colonial state managed by the British Parliament and monarchy. The Governor-General was elevated to the position of Viceroy, representing the British Crown, and thus symbolizing the fusion of traditional monarchical authority with modern administrative mechanisms. The Raj did not simply continue the company's policies, it built a more extensive bureaucratic apparatus. British officials now filled the highest ranks of government, while Indians were largely relegated to subordinate roles, especially in decision-making positions. The Indian civil service became the backbone of the administration, but it was dominated by the British elite. Entry into this elite corps required passing a competitive examination held only in London, effectively excluding most Indians from participating. While a few Indians would eventually gain entry, their numbers were negligible, and the real power remained firmly in British hands. Law and order became paramount under the new regime. The rebellion had shattered British confidence in the loyalty of Indian troops and civilians alike. In response, the British expanded the presence of European soldiers, reorganized native regiments, and instituted policies that aimed to reduce the likelihood of future insurrections. Indian soldiers were divided along ethnic and religious lines to prevent unity, and heavy surveillance became a regular part of life in major towns and cities. The police and judicial systems were expanded, but these institutions served more to reinforce colonial control than to deliver equitable justice. Laws were increasingly codified, and while this legal structure introduced concepts like property rights and formal contracts, it also entrenched new forms of inequality and dispossession. Economically, the Raj initiated massive changes that would have long-term consequences for Indian society. One of the most profound transformations was in the structure of land ownership and taxation. The British sought to systematize land revenue collection, implementing models such as the zamindari and riotwari systems. These models varied across regions, but generally aimed at maximizing state revenue. Traditional landholding patterns were disrupted, often favoring intermediaries or local elites who pledged loyalty to the British administration. This led to the disenfranchisement of many peasants and a growing rural indebtedness. Agricultural production became increasingly oriented toward cash crops such as cotton, indigo, and tea, commodities that fed the needs of British industries but left Indian farmers vulnerable to market fluctuations and food shortages. The construction of railways, telegraphs, and roads was another hallmark of British rule. Presented as a civilizing mission and a means of bringing modernity to the subcontinent, these infrastructure projects were primarily designed to serve imperial interests. Railways facilitated the rapid movement of troops and goods, while telegraphs enabled swift communication across the vast colony. Though they did bring economic opportunities and enhanced mobility to certain parts of Indian society, the benefits were unevenly distributed. The primary beneficiaries were British companies and colonial administrators. Many Indians remained impoverished and excluded from the supposed advantages of modernization. Culturally and socially, the Raj era was marked by both suppression and selective engagement. The British often portrayed themselves as guardians of civilization, tasked with uplifting a supposedly backward society. This paternalistic outlook justified various forms of control over Indian customs and institutions. While some reforms, such as the abolition of sati and promotion of widow remarriage, were supported by progressive Indian voices, others were driven by colonial agendas that lacked sensitivity to local contexts. English education was promoted, creating a class of Indians who were familiar with Western literature, law, and political thought. This new class played a paradoxical role. On one hand, they became intermediaries between the British and the broader Indian population. On the other hand, they would later become some of the fiercest critics of colonial rule, laying the intellectual foundations for the nationalist movement. Religion and identity also came under the purview of colonial scrutiny. The British, wary after the 1857 rebellion, which had significant religious undertones, adopted a policy of official non-interference in religious matters. Yet this was only on the surface. In reality, the colonial state often reinforced religious divisions as a strategy of control. Censuses categorized populations rigidly by religious identity, and laws were passed that emphasized communal distinctions. These administrative practices had long-term effects, deepening sectarian divisions that would continue to shape Indian politics for decades to come. The princely states, which made up about one-third of the Indian subcontinent, remained nominally autonomous under the Raj. However, their autonomy was closely monitored and often manipulated. The British entered into treaties with these states, maintaining control over their foreign affairs and defense while allowing local rulers to manage internal matters. This arrangement ensured loyalty through patronage and control through diplomacy. While some princely states prospered under this arrangement, others languished under corrupt and inefficient rule, propped up by British support for their strategic value. The British Raj also redefined India's relationship with the rest of the world. As a colony, India became a vital part of the British Empire's global strategy. Indian soldiers were deployed in imperial wars far beyond the subcontinent, including conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. India also became a key supplier of raw materials and a vast market for British manufactured goods. The colonial economy was structured to benefit Britain, and this dependency constrained India's own industrial and economic development. Despite the emergence of Indian entrepreneurs in sectors like textiles and banking, they often faced discriminatory policies and limited access to capital and markets. Resistance to colonial rule continued throughout the Raj period, though it evolved in form and scope. In the late 19th century, political organizations such as the Indian National Congress emerged, initially advocating for reforms within the framework of British rule. However, as frustration grew over British intransigence, the demands of Indian leaders began to shift towards self-governance and ultimately independence. The social reform movements of this period, driven by figures such as Rajaram Mohan Roy, Swami Vivekananda, and Jyotirao Phule, laid the groundwork for a broader questioning of colonial legitimacy. These movements challenged caste hierarchies, gender inequality, and religious orthodoxy, intertwining social justice with the struggle for political rights. Famines during the Raj highlighted the limits, and at times the cruelty, of colonial administration. The late 19th century saw several devastating famines, particularly in regions like Bengal and Deccan. These tragedies were often exacerbated by British policies that prioritized grain exports over local food needs and resisted interventions that might have saved millions. The official response to famines tended to emphasize free market principles and cost-saving measures, leading to widespread suffering. These events deeply eroded the moral claims of the colonial government and became rallying points for Indian nationalists. Education and the press also became powerful tools of dissent during the Raj. Missionary schools, government institutions, and private academies educated a growing number of Indians, many of whom went on to become lawyers, journalists, and activists. Newspapers and pamphlets in English and vernacular languages began to circulate critical opinions of British rule, challenging colonial narratives and spreading new political ideas. While the British attempted to suppress dissent through censorship and sedition laws, the public sphere had already been irrevocably altered. By the early 20th century, the foundations of the Raj were beginning to erode. Growing economic hardships, political awareness, and international influences, including the global rise of anti-colonial movements, converged to challenge the legitimacy of British rule. The First World War saw massive Indian contributions in terms of troops and resources, but hopes for post-war political concessions were largely disappointed. Discontent deepened, setting the stage for mass movements, civil disobedience, and eventual independence. The British Raj, which began with the intention of bringing stability after the 1857 uprising, became a complex and often contradictory system of control. It sought to present itself as modern and just, but it also relied on coercion, inequality, and cultural domination. The legacy of this period is still deeply felt in the institutions, borders, and social structures of the modern Indian subcontinent. The Raj did not simply govern India, it reshaped it for better and for worse, and in doing so set in motion the currents that would eventually lead to the end of colonialism and the birth of new nations. Conquering Canada, replacing France, and managing diversity. The conquest of Canada by the British during the mid-18th century marked a turning point not only for North America, but for global imperial dynamics. The story of how Britain supplanted France in this vast territory is one of military triumph, political restructuring, and the complex challenge of ruling over a diverse population that did not easily accept the new order. The transition from French to British rule in Canada would spark profound cultural negotiations and power realignments that would echo for generations to come. The roots of this monumental shift lie in the larger contest between European empires for global dominance. In the 18th century, Britain and France were at the height of their colonial rivalry. Their contest extended far beyond Europe to Asia, the Caribbean, and most crucially, North America. France had long established a stronghold in what was then known as New France, a territory that included not only the modern Canadian provinces of Quebec and Ontario, but extended into the interior of the continent. French fur traders, missionaries, and settlers had created a network of forts and alliances stretching through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. However, the French colonial population in Canada remained relatively small. In contrast, Britain's 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast were growing rapidly, outpacing New France in population and economic output. The pivotal conflict that would determine the fate of Canada was the 7 Years' War, known in its North American theater as the French and Indian War. The British, leveraging their superior naval power and colonial resources, launched a series of campaigns aimed at severing French control over key territories. Major victories at Louisbourg, Fort Duquesne, and finally the decisive Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, where General James Wolfe defeated French General Montcalm, sealed the fate of New France. The fall of Quebec and later Montreal meant the end of French political dominance in Canada. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris formally ceded all French territories in Canada to the British Crown, forever altering the balance of power in North America. However, military victory was just the beginning. The British now faced the daunting task of ruling over a population that was culturally, religiously, and linguistically distinct from the Anglo-Protestant norms of British society. The French-speaking Catholic population of Quebec posed a unique governance challenge. Their legal system, religious institutions, and way of life had evolved under French customs, not British law. The British government had to decide whether to assimilate this population into the British mold or find a way to accommodate its differences without compromising the empire's unity. Initially, there were attempts at direct control. British governors and administrators sought to impose English law, restrict the role of the Catholic Church, and encourage British settlement in Quebec. These policies met with resistance and failed to win the loyalty of the local population. British settlers were few, and the Francophone community remained dominant in terms of numbers and cultural presence. The British soon realized that a more pragmatic approach was necessary if they were to maintain peace and order in the region. In 1774, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act, one of the most significant pieces of legislation in Canadian colonial history. The act expanded the boundaries of Quebec, reinstated French civil law, and guaranteed the free practice of Catholicism. While these concessions angered some British settlers and were viewed with suspicion by American colonists to the south, they played a vital role in securing the loyalty of French Canadians. The Quebec Act set the tone for a policy of accommodation that would become a recurring theme in Canada's colonial administration. Managing diversity in Canada went beyond linguistic and religious lines. The territory was also home to numerous Indigenous nations whose lands and ways of life had been profoundly affected by both French and British colonial expansion. The British inherited not only territory, but also complex relationships with First Nations that had been shaped by decades of French alliances. Many Indigenous groups had sided with the French during the 7 Years' War, and their fate under British rule was uncertain. To stabilize these relationships, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This landmark document aimed to organize Britain's new North American empire and manage relations with Indigenous peoples. It recognized Indigenous land rights and established procedures for treaties. Although the proclamation was often ignored in practice, it laid a foundation for later legal frameworks regarding Indigenous rights in Canada. It also reflected an early recognition, however limited, of the complexities involved in governing a pluralistic society. As British rule became more entrenched, efforts to attract British settlers to Canada intensified. Waves of immigrants from the British Isles arrived, changing the demographic makeup of the colony. These newcomers brought with them British legal traditions, Protestant faiths, and different economic structures. Tensions occasionally flared between the established French-speaking population and the growing Anglophone communities. However, the British administration walked a careful line, ensuring that no single group felt completely alienated from the colonial system. The American Revolution added another layer of complexity to the British colonial project in Canada. Thousands of loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War, fled the newly formed United States and settled in Canada. These loyalists, many of whom were English-speaking Protestants, were granted land and support from the British government. Their arrival dramatically increased the Anglophone population, particularly in what would become Ontario and the Maritime provinces. The influx of loyalists led to the creation of new colonies such as New Brunswick and reshaped the cultural and political landscape of British North America. This increasing diversity within Canada prompted administrative changes. In 1791, the Constitutional Act divided the province of Quebec into Upper Canada, mostly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, mostly French-speaking. This division allowed each region to retain its cultural and legal traditions while still being part of the British Empire. It was an attempt to balance unity with pluralism, acknowledging the realities on the ground rather than forcing a uniform identity. Despite these efforts, tensions simmered. In the early 19th century, demands for political reform grew among both French and English settlers. The colonial assemblies had limited power, and many inhabitants resented the control exercised by British-appointed governors and elites. These frustrations culminated in the rebellions of 1837 to 1838, which broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada. Although the uprisings were swiftly suppressed, they signaled the need for more inclusive governance. In response, the British government dispatched Lord Durham to investigate the causes of unrest. His report recommended the unification of Upper and Lower Canada and the introduction of responsible government. While Durham's call for assimilation of the French was controversial and largely resisted, his broader suggestions laid the groundwork for modern Canadian democracy. In 1841, the Act of Union merged the two Canadas into a single province, with a legislature that gradually moved toward greater self-government. Throughout the 19th century, Canada continued to evolve as a mosaic of cultures, languages, and identities. British rule provided a framework, but it did not eliminate the deep-rooted differences within the population. French Canadians maintained a distinct cultural identity, grounded in language, religion, and historical memory. Indigenous peoples, meanwhile, continued to face pressures on their lands and ways of life, despite formal treaties and proclamations. The expansion westward brought even more diversity. As settlers moved into the prairies and British Columbia, they encountered new indigenous nations and welcomed immigrants from Europe and Asia. Managing this diversity became a defining feature of the Canadian colonial experience. British authorities sought to foster loyalty through education, infrastructure, and trade, but they also implemented policies such as residential schools for Indigenous children that had devastating consequences and are now recognized as profoundly harmful. Despite these challenges, the idea of a multicultural Canada began to take shape, even in the colonial period. The British model of indirect rule, combined with local accommodations, allowed for a degree of cultural autonomy that was rare in many other empires. This approach laid the foundation for the later Confederation of Canada in 1867, when the colonies of British North America joined together to form a dominion under the British Crown. The conquest of Canada, then, was not merely a military event. It was a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and compromise. Britain replaced France as the colonial power, but it could not simply erase the legacies that French and Indigenous peoples had built. Managing diversity required innovation in governance, a recognition of pluralism, and a willingness to adapt imperial ideals to colonial realities. Today, the echoes of this colonial past can still be felt. The legal traditions, linguistic duality, and cultural pluralism of modern Canada owe much to the early efforts to manage diversity under British rule. The conquest that began on the battlefield ultimately extended into the realm of law, society, and identity. Understanding this history is essential to grasping the enduring character of Canada as a nation shaped not by uniformity, but by a complex and often contested coexistence. As British power grew stronger through the 19th century, it also encountered growing global pressures. The Industrial Revolution transformed the economy, and political ideas about self-rule and democracy began spreading across the empire. In Canada, this translated into demands for local control over governance, trade, and legal systems. While Britain continued to maintain symbolic and military authority, many of its colonies were increasingly governing themselves in practice. Canada led this trend by pioneering the Dominion model, balancing allegiance to the crown with practical self-determination. The peaceful transition from colony to Dominion and later to full sovereignty in the 20th century was made possible in part because of the early foundations laid after the conquest. By choosing not to forcefully erase French culture, by attempting to structure fair relationships with indigenous peoples, however flawed in execution, and by gradually expanding political rights to various groups, British administrators created a flexible political system that could evolve. This flexibility, born out of the need to manage a diverse population, became one of Canada's greatest strengths. Thus, the conquest of Canada did more than redraw maps. It redrew the very concept of colonial governance. It demonstrated that power could be maintained not just through force, but through negotiation, tolerance, and adaptation. The challenge of managing diversity in Canada after the fall of New France remains one of the most significant chapters in the global history of the empire. It stands as a reminder that conquest does not end with victory. It begins a long, complex journey of understanding, inclusion, and nation-building. While the initial phases of conquest and accommodation shaped the colonial identity of Canada, the later decades of the 19th century would introduce new dimensions of complexity driven by immigration, industrialization, and shifting global currents. Britain's strategy in Canada evolved with the rise of competing powers and the challenge of maintaining cohesion across vast territories. The empire needed to reinforce its presence in a region that was increasingly multi-ethnic, linguistically split, and culturally varied, all while balancing the tensions between central authority and local aspirations. One of the most defining developments after the mid-1800s was the arrival of large numbers of immigrants, not only from the British Isles, but from non-British countries as well. Germans, Ukrainians, Italians, Chinese, and Scandinavians arrived in growing numbers, drawn by opportunities in agriculture, mining, and rail construction. Unlike earlier settlers, many of these groups brought entirely new customs, languages, and faiths that did not align with either the English or French models already present in Canada. The colonial government encouraged this migration to populate the interior and solidify claims over Western lands, but it also had to construct a broader definition of what it meant to be a subject of the British Crown in such a diverse environment. The policy response to this new wave of diversity included the development of institutions designed to absorb and regulate difference without promoting outright assimilation. Public schooling, for instance, became a tool to instill loyalty to the Crown and teach British civic values, but it was also adapted to reflect regional cultural realities. In Quebec, for example, education remained primarily under Catholic control and preserved the French language, whereas in Ontario and the Western provinces, Protestant institutions dominated. These parallel systems allowed communities to maintain their heritage while participating in a shared colonial framework, reinforcing the notion that unity did not have to mean uniformity. Simultaneously, infrastructure became a symbol of national coherence. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the late 19th century was not merely an economic endeavor, but a political statement. It linked distant provinces and remote settlements to the administrative centers of power, facilitating movement, commerce, and communication across vast geographic and cultural divides. The railway became a physical manifestation of British Canada's ambition to create a transcontinental nation under one flag, binding disparate populations into a singular, if still loosely held, polity. Yet alongside these unifying efforts, contradictions and injustices persisted. Indigenous communities were often left out of the promises of opportunity and citizenship extended to settlers. While treaties were signed across the prairies, they were frequently misunderstood or violated, and Indigenous governance systems were steadily undermined by the imposition of the Indian Act in 1876. This legislation centralized control over Indigenous affairs under the federal government, significantly curtailing autonomy and enforcing policies aimed at cultural eradication. Residential schools established under this regime sought to eliminate Indigenous languages and identities in favor of Anglo-Christian norms, leaving a legacy of trauma and disconnection that remains unresolved today. As the Dominion matured into the 20th century, the question of loyalty became increasingly important, especially during global conflicts. Both world wars acted as tests of unity within Canada's layered society. In World War I, for instance, conscription became a divisive issue. French Canadians, who had long viewed themselves as culturally distinct and who often felt alienated from the British imperial agenda, strongly opposed mandatory military service. Their resistance was not born of disloyalty, but of a different understanding of what their role within Canada should be. Meanwhile, many English Canadians viewed participation in the war as a demonstration of imperial loyalty and national strength. This divergence sparked deep political rifts, especially in Quebec, and revealed the fragility of national cohesion when policies failed to account for cultural complexity. In response to these strains, the interwar period witnessed attempts to redefine Canadian identity on more inclusive terms. Intellectuals, politicians, and community leaders began to speak of Canada not just as a British outpost, but as a mosaic of peoples contributing to a shared destiny. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 formalized Canada's legislative independence from Britain, allowing the country to chart its own course in domestic and foreign policy. While symbolic ties to the monarchy remained, Canada was increasingly seen as a country capable of self-definition, and that definition would come to rest on the idea of peaceful pluralism rather than imperial conformity. This evolving national self-image was further tested in the decades following World War II, as decolonization spread across the globe and migration patterns shifted dramatically. Canada opened its doors to refugees from war-torn Europe, followed by newcomers from Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. These migrants often settled in urban centers, contributing to the multicultural fabric of cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Their presence challenged the older British-French binary and forced a rethinking of citizenship, identity, and integration. By the 1960s and 70s, multiculturalism emerged as an explicit policy, enshrined by the federal government as a defining feature of Canadian identity. While this marked a radical departure from earlier models of assimilation, it also echoed the colonial precedent of managing difference through institutional recognition rather than suppression. Each wave of diversity brought its own tensions and debates, but the underlying strategy remained: to weave varied communities into the national fabric without erasing their distinctiveness. At the same time, French-Canadian nationalism gained momentum, particularly in Quebec, where demands for greater autonomy culminated in 2 referendums on sovereignty. Though both failed, they underscored the enduring desire of French Canadians to assert their place in the country on their own terms. The federal response, most notably the Official Languages Act and various constitutional reforms, represented continued efforts to reconcile unity with cultural plurality. Looking back across the centuries, it becomes evident that the British conquest of Canada did not lead to a monolithic society, but rather laid the groundwork for a nation built upon negotiated diversity. From the coexistence of English and French traditions to the layered histories of Indigenous peoples and the contributions of later immigrants, Canada's path has been one of constant recalibration. This dynamic model, born of conflict, compromise, and adaptation, stands as a unique legacy of the imperial era. The management of diversity, far from being a modern invention, has deep historical roots in the colonial encounter between Britain and New France. While often fraught with inequality and oversight, the efforts to govern a population so varied in background, language, faith, and tradition also birthed a political culture that prizes inclusion and coexistence. The legacy of conquest, therefore, is not just one of territorial gain or administrative control. It is also a story of cultural endurance, transformation, and the continuous effort to balance difference with common purpose. World War I and the Empire. World War I, often referred to as the Great War, reshaped not only the political landscape of Europe, but also significantly influenced the fate and structure of empires across the globe. The conflict, which began in 1914 and ended in 1918, was not merely a clash of European powers, but also a confrontation involving vast imperial systems that stretched across continents. These empires, most notably the British, French, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German, were deeply interwoven into the war's origins, its strategies, and its consequences. The war revealed both the strength and fragility of imperial rule and heralded a period of intense reevaluation of empire in the post-war world. The British Empire at its zenith played a critical role in the Allied war effort. It mobilized not just the resources of the British Isles, but also those of its dominions and colonies. Troops from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and parts of Africa and the Caribbean were deployed across various fronts. The global nature of the empire turned the European war into a truly world-spanning conflict. India, in particular, provided over 1 million soldiers and laborers, with many serving on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. Despite their immense contribution, the colonial troops were often subjected to racial discrimination and denied the recognition afforded to European soldiers. France, too, relied heavily on its colonies in Africa and Asia. Troops from Algeria, Senegal, Indochina, and Madagascar were called upon to support the French war effort. These soldiers were often deployed in grueling conditions and were expected to serve with loyalty to a republic that did not grant them full rights. The war brought the colonies closer to the metropole militarily and economically, yet it also laid bare the inequalities inherent in the imperial relationship. These contradictions would later become sources of anti-colonial agitation. For the German Empire, World War I was both a demonstration of ambition and a catastrophe. Germany's colonial possessions in Africa and the Pacific were quickly targeted by the Allies. While Germany had established its empire later than Britain or France, it had nonetheless secured significant holdings in territories like modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, and parts of New Guinea. During the war, these were seized by Allied forces, including troops from Britain, France, Japan, and Australia. The loss of overseas colonies dealt a severe blow to Germany's global ambitions and was formalized in the Treaty of Versailles, which redistributed German territories among the victors under the League of Nations mandates. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the war as a multi-ethnic empire already struggling with internal tensions, comprising a patchwork of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and more. The empire's involvement in the war exacerbated existing divisions. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, nationalist movements within the empire gained momentum. The defeat of the Central Powers led to the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with new nation-states emerging from its ruins, including Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. This redrawing of borders was a dramatic example of how the war shattered imperial systems. The Ottoman Empire, long in decline by the early 20th century, saw World War I as a potential means of revitalization. Aligning with the Central Powers, the Ottomans engaged in campaigns across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles. While the empire achieved some military successes, such as repelling the Allied invasion at Gallipoli, it ultimately could not withstand the pressures of total war. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by the British and fueled by discontent with Ottoman rule, further weakened the empire's cohesion. By the war's end, the Ottoman Empire was a shell of its former self, and its dissolution led to the creation of modern nation-states such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine under British and French mandates. Russia's imperial role in the war was deeply entangled with its domestic upheavals. The Russian Empire, already suffering from internal instability, mobilized vast numbers of soldiers to fight the Central Powers. The strain of the war on the Russian economy, society, and military was immense. The Tsarist regime faced mounting discontent, culminating in the 1917 revolutions. The Bolshevik takeover brought Russia out of the war, but also marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and the collapse of the Russian Empire. In its place arose the Soviet Union, an ideologically driven entity that rejected the traditional imperialist model, even as it retained control over many of the former empire's territories. The war's impact on empire was not limited to the European metropoles. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the conflict generated new political awareness and movements. Colonial soldiers who had served in the war returned home with altered perceptions of power and identity. They had witnessed firsthand the vulnerability of European powers and had seen the contradictions between the ideals professed by the colonizers, such as freedom and democracy, and the reality of imperial domination. These experiences sowed the seeds of future independence movements. Economically, the war accelerated the integration of colonies into global markets, particularly through the increased demand for raw materials and foodstuffs. However, the exploitation of colonial resources during wartime deepened resentment. In India, for example, the post-war period saw rising political agitation led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, who had initially supported the British war effort but later championed non-cooperation in response to unfulfilled promises of self-rule. In Africa and the Caribbean, new political leaders began to emerge, questioning the legitimacy of continued colonial governance. World War I also brought about new ideologies that challenged the imperial order. The principle of national self-determination, promoted by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, was selectively applied by the victors. While it inspired nationalist leaders in colonized regions, it was largely restricted to European contexts, reinforcing the perception of imperial hypocrisy. Nonetheless, the language of self-determination became a powerful rhetorical tool for anti-colonial activists in the decades to follow. Another significant outcome of the war was the creation of the League of Nations. Although envisioned as a platform for peace and cooperation, the League's mandate system effectively rebranded imperialism. Former Ottoman and German colonies were administered by Allied powers under the guise of guiding them to independence, but in reality, this often extended colonial control. The mandate system thus reflected both the persistence and the evolution of imperialism in the post-war world. The psychological impact of the war on imperial powers was profound. The unprecedented carnage, the collapse of old orders, and the immense sacrifices made by colonial subjects led many to reconsider the moral and political foundations of empire. In Britain and France, debates intensified over the cost of empire and the need for reform. These discussions, while not always resulting in immediate change, contributed to the gradual reimagining of the imperial relationship. The war also marked a shift in global power dynamics. The United States, which entered the conflict in 1917, emerged as a key player on the world stage, less encumbered by colonial entanglements. Its rise signaled the beginning of a new era in which traditional empires would face competition from newer forms of influence. Japan, too, capitalized on the war to expand its reach in Asia, laying the groundwork for future conflicts over imperial dominance in the region. For many colonial subjects, the war experience was a paradox. It was a moment of profound suffering, sacrifice, and disillusionment, but also one of awakening. The war demonstrated the vulnerability of empires and gave rise to a generation of leaders who would go on to challenge imperial rule. The interwar period witnessed growing unrest in colonial territories, and the ideas that germinated during the Great War would bear fruit in the wave of decolonization that followed World War II. In retrospect, World War I did not end empire overnight, but it profoundly transformed the nature of imperialism. It exposed the limitations of coercive rule and highlighted the necessity for new forms of legitimacy. Empires emerged from the war both shaken and determined to adapt, yet unable to fully contain the pressures building within their dominions. The war's legacy was thus one of both continuity and change, a tipping point that set the stage for the dramatic reordering of global power in the 20th century. The Interwar Empire, strikes, reforms, and rising nationalism. Between the two world wars, the British Empire found itself in a state of both consolidation and unraveling. While the empire still spanned vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, the years between 1919 and 1939 saw significant shifts in the nature of imperial governance, the relationship between colony and metropole, and the rising tide of nationalist sentiment. At the heart of this transformation was the dual challenge of maintaining control over a diverse and increasingly discontented colonial population, while simultaneously managing domestic political and economic pressures in Britain itself. These 2 decades were marked by a series of significant strikes, political reforms, and the strengthening of anti-colonial movements that would lay the groundwork for eventual decolonization in the post-World War II era. The aftermath of the First World War significantly weakened Britain's economic and military capacity, making it more difficult to project power across its empire. The war had drained Britain's treasury and placed immense pressure on its industrial base. At the same time, millions of colonial subjects had served in British forces during the war, and many returned home with heightened political awareness and a growing sense of entitlement to political rights and autonomy. This dynamic fostered a climate of expectation and restlessness across the empire, particularly in colonies such as India, Egypt, and the West Indies, where political agitation began to take on new forms and intensity. In India, the war had intensified Indian expectations of political reform. The British had made vague promises of increased self-governance in return for Indian support during the war, but these promises were slow to materialize. The Government of India Act of 1919 did introduce a limited form of diarchy in provincial governments, granting Indian ministers control over some departments, but ultimate authority remained with the British. This partial concession was seen as inadequate by many Indian nationalists. The subsequent Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, where British troops killed hundreds of unarmed Indian civilians during a peaceful protest, became a turning point that galvanized the Indian independence movement. Mahatma Gandhi emerged as a central figure, advocating nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience as tools of political struggle. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Gandhi's campaigns inspired widespread participation from urban intellectuals to rural peasants. The Salt March in 1930 was particularly symbolic, demonstrating the power of mass nonviolent protest and the willingness of ordinary Indians to challenge imperial authority. While British authorities responded with arrests and repression, the image of peaceful protesters confronting colonial rule deeply influenced global opinion. Although full independence was still years away, the interwar period saw the Indian National Congress transform into a mass-based political movement capable of challenging British rule on a national scale. In the Middle East, the post-war period brought the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and with it, the emergence of new territories under British and French control. The British mandates in Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan were particularly significant. While presented as temporary custodianship intended to prepare these territories for eventual independence, in practice, the mandates often functioned as direct colonial rule under another name. In Iraq, nationalist opposition to British control flared into open revolt in 1920, which was met with a brutal military response. The cost of maintaining order led Britain to revise its strategy, eventually installing a Hashemite monarchy under King Faisal, which provided a semblance of local legitimacy while still preserving British influence behind the scenes. Palestine presented an even more complex challenge. Britain's Balfour Declaration of 1917 had promised to support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, while simultaneously assuring Arab inhabitants of their civil and religious rights. As Jewish immigration increased during the 1920s and 1930s, tensions between Arab and Jewish communities escalated. The British administration struggled to maintain control amid growing violence and political polarization. By the end of the 1930s, Britain was facing armed revolts by Arab groups who perceived British policy as favoring Zionist ambitions, leading to harsh crackdowns and the eventual reassessment of Britain's position in the region. In Africa, economic hardships during the Great Depression exacerbated social tensions and prompted labor unrest in several British colonies. In West Africa, cities like Lagos and Accra became centers of political discussion and labor activism. Educated African elites began to articulate visions of self-governance and criticize the paternalistic nature of colonial rule. In East Africa, Indian and African communities alike began to question their political exclusion and economic marginalization. The British response often involved both reform and repression. Limited political concessions, such as the introduction of elected councils or advisory roles for local leaders, were coupled with measures to suppress dissent, including censorship and detention without trial. Strikes became a key form of resistance throughout the empire during the interwar years. Labor unions in the Caribbean, for example, mobilized workers who had long endured low wages and harsh working conditions on sugar plantations and in ports. The 1930s saw waves of strikes and protests in Trinidad, Jamaica, and British Guyana, fueled by economic decline and inspired by both local grievances and broader anti-imperial sentiments. These movements were often led by emerging nationalist leaders who would later play crucial roles in their country's paths to independence. In response, British authorities initiated some social and economic reforms, including labor protections and limited welfare programs, hoping to stave off further unrest without ceding political control. In Egypt, nationalist aspirations were similarly emboldened by the collapse of Ottoman authority and the wartime presence of British troops. Although Britain declared Egypt nominally independent in 1922, real power remained in the hands of the British High Commissioner. Egyptian politics during the interwar period were marked by conflict between the nationalist Wafd Day party, the monarchy, and British officials. Street demonstrations, student activism, and strikes were common, particularly in urban centers like Cairo and Alexandria. While Egyptian nationalists succeeded in achieving some political concessions, including a constitution and parliamentary system, Britain retained control over defense, communications, and foreign policy. This ambiguous status left many Egyptians dissatisfied and contributed to ongoing instability. The interwar years also witnessed a growing ideological challenge to empire from within Britain itself. The economic strain of maintaining the empire, particularly during the Great Depression, led to increased scrutiny of imperial expenditure. Some members of the Labour Party and progressive intellectuals began to argue that the empire was incompatible with modern democratic values. While this did not translate into a wholesale rejection of imperialism by the British public or political elite, it did create a space for debate about the future of the empire. Organizations such as the Fabian Society and thinkers like Leonard Woolf questioned the moral basis of colonial rule and advocated for a transition towards a more cooperative, federated form of Commonwealth. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 marked a significant shift in Britain's imperial structure, as it granted legislative independence to the self-governing dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and later Ireland. These dominions had already achieved a high degree of autonomy, but the statute formalized their status as equal partners within the British Commonwealth. This development reflected both the changing balance of power within the empire and Britain's recognition that direct control was no longer sustainable or desirable in all cases. However, the statute did not apply to the colonies in Asia, Africa, or the Caribbean, where aspirations for similar status were largely ignored or suppressed. In Malaya and Burma, the British faced growing pressure from nationalist groups demanding political representation and economic reforms. In Burma, student protests and strikes highlighted the frustrations of a population subjected to foreign rule and economic hardship. The separation of Burma from India in 1937, though framed as administrative reorganization, was partly intended to weaken nationalist unity and limit the influence of Indian politics on Burmese activists. Meanwhile, in Malaya, the British were primarily concerned with protecting the lucrative rubber and tin industries, and thus maintained tight control, favoring elite collaboration over popular participation. Nationalist movements in both regions would continue to simmer beneath the surface, erupting more forcefully after the Second World War. The interwar empire was thus a complex and often contradictory entity, characterized by a mix of reform and repression, adaptation and inertia. While the British government made some efforts to accommodate the demands of colonial subjects through constitutional changes, administrative restructuring, and limited economic reforms, these measures were often insufficient or implemented too slowly to address the deep-rooted grievances of the colonized. Moreover, reforms were frequently designed to maintain imperial control rather than empower local populations, leading to widespread disillusionment and further fueling nationalist sentiment. Communication technologies such as the radio and the printing press played a significant role in spreading nationalist ideas during the interwar period. Newspapers and pamphlets in colonial languages helped educate the public about their rights and connected local struggles to broader global movements for freedom and justice. The emergence of international organizations such as the League Against Imperialism also helped colonial activists find allies abroad and frame their causes within the context of global anti-colonialism. Exiled leaders and students studying in Europe brought back radical ideologies, including socialism, communism, and Pan-Africanism, which offered new frameworks for resisting imperial dominance. Women also began to play more visible roles in nationalist movements during the interwar period. In India, figures like Sarojini Naidu joined again in political campaigns, while in the West Indies and Africa, female educators and writers began to articulate critiques of both colonialism and gender inequality. Though often sidelined by male leaders, these women laid important groundwork for more inclusive nationalist movements in the decades to follow. The economic crisis of the 1930s further exposed the vulnerabilities of the imperial system. The Great Depression led to falling commodity prices, increased unemployment, and growing hardship throughout the colonies. Many colonial governments responded by cutting spending and raising taxes, deepening popular resentment. In some cases, colonial subjects who had previously been passive or acquiescent became politically mobilized, seeing empire not as a source of stability or protection, but as an impediment to social and economic progress. By the eve of the Second World War, the British Empire remained vast and powerful, but its foundations were increasingly shaky. The combination of economic strain, political agitation, and ideological shifts had undermined the legitimacy of imperial rule in many parts of the world. Nationalist movements had grown more organized and more assertive, and colonial subjects had begun to articulate their own visions of modernity, development, and freedom. Visions that no longer required or even tolerated imperial oversight. The British government, while still determined to preserve its global influence, found itself grappling with the reality that the age of unquestioned imperial authority was rapidly drawing to a close. What the interwar period revealed was not just the growing strength of anti-colonial movements, but the deep contradictions at the heart of the empire itself. The ideals of liberal democracy espoused by Britain at home stood in stark contrast to the realities of colonial rule abroad. Strikes, protests, and political agitation were not isolated events, but part of a broader global awakening among colonized peoples. The interwar years may not have brought independence to most British colonies, but they fundamentally altered the balance of power between rulers and ruled, setting the stage for the seismic changes that would follow in the mid-20th century. World War II and the strain on empire. World War II marked a pivotal moment in the history of global empires, the particular empire, the British Empire, as it strained the very foundations of colonial control and reshaped the dynamics between imperial powers and their colonies. The conflict, which spanned from 1939 to 1945, demanded an immense mobilization of human, material, and financial resources from across the empire. Colonies in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific were called upon to contribute soldiers, laborers, and raw materials to support the war effort. This demand, while initially accepted under the pressures of loyalty and obligation, gradually exposed the deep inequalities and tensions embedded in the imperial system. As the war progressed, the relationship between the metropole and the colonies shifted, often irreversibly, laying the groundwork for the wave of decolonization that followed in its aftermath. Millions of colonial subjects were recruited or volunteered to fight for the Allied cause. Indian soldiers played a vital role in several theaters of war, from North Africa to Southeast Asia, and their contributions were both strategic and symbolic. Africans from British colonies also enlisted in large numbers, often fighting in unfamiliar terrains under difficult conditions. Caribbean troops served valiantly, despite being marginalized and frequently assigned non-combat roles. Their sacrifices, however, were often met with limited recognition and unequal treatment compared to their European counterparts. This disparity sowed seeds of resentment and gave rise to new political consciousness among those who had experienced firsthand the contradictions of imperial rhetoric versus colonial reality. The economic strain of World War II was monumental, not only on Britain, but on its entire empire. To sustain the war, Britain leaned heavily on the wealth and resources of its colonies. India, for instance, was made to finance a significant portion of the British war effort, leading to severe economic dislocation at home. The diversion of resources to support the military campaign contributed to inflation, scarcity, and in the case of India, played a role in the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1943. This tragedy, which claimed millions of lives, revealed the extent to which colonial governance could fail its subjects, especially when imperial interests took precedence over local welfare. The famine became a symbol of imperial neglect and highlighted the growing disillusionment with colonial rule. The war also had profound political consequences within the colonies. As the imperial powers focused their energies on the global conflict, colonial movements found new spaces to organize, protest, and advocate for self-determination. In India, the Quit India movement, launched in 1942 by the Indian National Congress, demanded an immediate end to British rule. Although it was suppressed, the scale of participation demonstrated the growing strength of nationalist sentiment. Similarly, in Africa and the Caribbean, the experience of wartime mobilization and the interaction with global ideas of freedom and democracy emboldened local leaders to question colonial authority. Veterans returned with a broader perspective and a sense of entitlement to the rights and liberties they had fought to defend abroad. The strain on empire was not only logistical and economic, but also ideological. The Allied powers, particularly Britain and the United States, framed the war as a struggle for freedom, democracy, and justice against totalitarian aggression. Yet this message rang hollow for many colonial subjects who lived under authoritarian imperial regimes. The contradiction between the war's stated ideals and the realities of colonial domination became increasingly difficult to reconcile. This gap was not lost on international observers either. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, promised the right of all peoples to self-determination. Although Churchill later clarified that this did not apply to the colonies, the damage had been done. The Charter was interpreted by many as a moral commitment to decolonization, further fueling anti-colonial aspirations. The Japanese advance in Asia during the early years of the war exposed the vulnerability of European empires in the East. The rapid fall of British-controlled Singapore in 1942 shocked the world and shattered the illusion of European invincibility. The occupation of British colonies such as Burma and Malaya by Japanese forces disrupted colonial administration and emboldened resistance movements. In some cases, nationalist groups collaborated with the Japanese, hoping to secure independence through foreign assistance. This complex wartime dynamic showed that colonial subjects were no longer passive participants, but were actively seeking ways to assert their political agency, even in the midst of global chaos. In the post-war period, the strain of the conflict became even more apparent. Britain emerged from World War II victorious but economically weakened. Its global position had shifted, and its ability to maintain a vast empire was increasingly questioned. The costs of the war had drained the national treasury, and rebuilding the domestic economy became a top priority. Maintaining colonial administrations and military presence overseas required funds that Britain could no longer afford. At the same time, pressure from nationalist movements within the colonies, coupled with international scrutiny and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as global powers, created a new geopolitical landscape in which empire was increasingly untenable. The United States, while a wartime ally, was ideologically committed to a vision of self-determination and frequently expressed its disapproval of European colonialism. American economic aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act and later the Marshall Plan came with implicit and explicit expectations regarding imperial reform. Similarly, the Soviet Union promoted anti-colonialism as part of its broader ideological campaign. As a result, Britain found itself caught between international pressures and domestic constraints, forced to reconsider its imperial commitments in light of new global realities. The end of the war saw the acceleration of independence movements across the empire. India gained independence in 1947, a landmark moment that signaled the beginning of the end for the British Empire. In Africa, nationalist leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya began mobilizing mass movements that would, over the next 2 decades, lead to a wave of decolonization. In the Caribbean, political parties rooted in labor movements and social justice began demanding constitutional reforms and greater autonomy. The war had fundamentally altered the relationship between colonizer and colonized, and returning to the pre-war status quo was no longer possible. Even within Britain, public opinion began to shift. The war effort had created a sense of shared sacrifice among the British people, but it had also highlighted the disparity between domestic needs and the maintenance of distant colonies. The election of the Labour government in 1945 brought to power leaders more sympathetic to social reform and less committed to imperial expansion. The focus turned inward, toward the creation of a welfare state, rebuilding infrastructure, and improving the quality of life for British citizens. Empire, once a source of pride and economic benefit, increasingly came to be seen as a burden. This ideological transformation was not immediate, nor was it without resistance. In some colonies, the path to independence was marked by violence, as imperial authorities resisted demands for change. In places like Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising was met with brutal repression. Yet even these conflicts underscored the depth of colonial grievances and the determination of local populations to secure their freedom. The war had planted the seeds of change, and though decolonization would unfold unevenly, the momentum was undeniable. Beyond the British Empire, other European powers experienced similar strains. France, which had been occupied during the war, faced a major crisis in its colonies, especially in Indochina and Algeria. The Dutch struggled to reassert control in Indonesia, while the Portuguese held on to their African colonies far longer at great cost. The pattern was clear. World War II had irreversibly weakened the grip of European imperialism across the globe. In sum, World War II served as both a catalyst and a crucible for the transformation of the imperial world order. The strain it placed on empires was multifaceted: military, economic, political, and ideological. It exposed the fragility of colonial structures and highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. It empowered new voices, inspired new visions, and challenged old hierarchies. While victory in the war preserved the nominal status of imperial powers, it also heralded the beginning of the end for empires as they had previously existed. The war did not cause decolonization on its own, but it dramatically accelerated the process and changed the terms of the global conversation about power, justice, and sovereignty. The empire that had once seemed eternal was now fading, reshaped by the very conflict it had helped to win: Caribbean conquest, sugar, slavery, and profit. The story of the Caribbean conquest is one of ambition, cruelty, and vast economic transformation. At its heart lay the pursuit of profit, and no commodity symbolized this more powerfully than sugar. The Caribbean islands, lush and fertile, became epicenters of colonial rivalry as European powers scrambled to stake their claims in the region. Spain had made early gains in the Americas, but soon England, France, the Netherlands, and even Denmark sought to carve out their own empires in the Caribbean basin. The tropical climate, suitable for sugarcane cultivation, turned these islands into some of the most economically valuable territories in the colonial world. The arrival of Europeans was swift and decisive. They displaced or decimated indigenous populations through warfare, disease, and forced labor. Once native resistance had been quelled and the lands seized, European colonists began experimenting with crops that could flourish in the tropical environment. Sugarcane, introduced from the east, proved a perfect match. It was not a new crop, but the scale on which it would be grown in the Caribbean was unprecedented. Sugar was not just a sweetener, it became a symbol of wealth and power. European demand skyrocketed, and the Caribbean plantations were poised to meet it. But sugar production was labor-intensive, demanding a vast workforce for planting, cutting, transporting, and processing cane. Indigenous labor soon gave way to a more brutal system, African slavery. With the transatlantic slave trade already established, European powers found a solution to their labor problem by forcibly transporting millions of Africans to the Caribbean. The so-called triangular trade emerged. European goods were traded for African slaves who were shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas, and the resulting sugar and other colonial goods were transported back to Europe. The slave ships were floating horrors. Captives were chained below deck in suffocating conditions, deprived of basic hygiene and space. Mortality rates were appalling. Those who survived the Middle Passage arrived in the Caribbean already weakened, only to face a lifetime of backbreaking labor under the lash. The plantations operated under a system of relentless cruelty. Slaves worked from dawn until dusk in the scorching heat, often on minimal rations, with constant surveillance and the looming threat of violence. Resistance was met with brutal punishments designed to instill fear and compliance. Yet the human cost was deemed acceptable by plantation owners and investors who saw only profit. Sugar plantations yielded immense wealth. Refined sugar, molasses, and rum became essential commodities in global trade. Cities like London, Nantes, Amsterdam, and Lisbon grew rich on the backs of enslaved laborers, and Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, became the jewels of their respective empires. In some places, the population of slaves vastly outnumbered that of European colonists, creating a society teetering on the edge of revolt. Indeed, the brutality of the plantation system could not go unanswered forever. Across the islands, enslaved people resisted in both overt and covert ways. Some fled into the mountains and jungles, forming maroon communities. Others engaged in sabotage, slowed work, or fought back directly. The most dramatic and successful resistance occurred in Saint-Domingue, where a slave uprising led by figures like Toussaint Louverture eventually gave rise to the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolt in the New World, resulting in the creation of an independent Black Republic in 1804. The profitability of sugar was so great that it blinded empires to the moral and human toll it exacted. European powers waged wars over sugar-producing colonies, such as the numerous Anglo-French conflicts in the 17th and 18th centuries. Islands changed hands not because of their size, but because of their output. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, for example, saw France give up much of its territory in North America, but retain lucrative Caribbean possessions like Guadeloupe and Martinique, an indication of the island's immense value. Life for the enslaved did not improve with time. Generations were born and died in bondage. Children were put to work young, and families were often separated. While the slaveholders enjoyed opulent lifestyles, their wealth was rooted in a system that denied the very humanity of those who made it possible. The intellectual and political movements of the 18th century, such as the Enlightenment, began to challenge the legitimacy of slavery, but economic interests were deeply entrenched. The abolitionist movement, though growing steadily in Europe and the Americas, faced enormous resistance from those who benefited from the status quo. However, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, moral arguments combined with economic and political shifts began to turn the tide. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in its empire by 1834. Other European powers followed, though often slowly and reluctantly. The end of slavery did not mean true freedom or equality for formerly enslaved people, who continued to face systemic discrimination, poverty, and disenfranchisement. The legacy of the Caribbean sugar plantations is complex and enduring. The wealth generated fueled the rise of European cities, funded industrial expansion, and contributed to the shaping of the modern world. At the same time, the brutality of slavery and its deep social scars persist in the cultural memory and social structures of the Caribbean. Many island nations still grapple with the long-term consequences of colonial exploitation, economic dependence, racial inequality, and underdevelopment. Even today, the landscape of the Caribbean bears the mark of its sugar past. Ruins of old plantations dot the countryside. Museums and memorials now stand where mills once turned and overseers barked orders. Scholars and descendants seek to reconstruct the stories erased by colonial records, giving voice to those who suffered under the yoke of slavery. The narrative is no longer only one of profit and empire. It is increasingly a story of endurance, survival, and remembrance. In understanding the Caribbean conquest through the lens of sugar, slavery, and profit, one must acknowledge the duality of human ambition and cruelty. The drive for wealth propelled empires to the region, but it came at an enormous cost. The islands, beautiful and bountiful, became fields of suffering for countless people whose labor was deemed invisible in the ledgers of merchants and planters. The sweet taste of sugar, for centuries a luxury and a staple, was in truth soaked in the blood and toil of those who were denied their freedom. Looking back, the Caribbean conquest cannot be viewed merely as a chapter in colonial expansion. It must be recognized as a pivotal point in global history, one that shaped modern capitalism, transformed societies, and forced a reckoning with the ethics of profit at any cost. The Caribbean was not just a battleground for empires, but a crucible of human endurance and resistance. Its story is not finished. It lives on in the culture, music, languages, and identities of the people who call these islands home. As such, it demands remembrance not just of the empires that profited, but of the lives sacrificed in the name of sugar. Colonial Africa, the British in Egypt, Sudan, and Southern Africa. The British involvement in Africa during the colonial period was complex, far-reaching, and often marked by a blend of strategic interests, economic ambitions, and cultural justifications. Among the most significant regions of British activity were Egypt, Sudan, and Southern Africa, each serving distinct roles within the wider imperial structure. While Egypt represented a strategic linchpin due to its proximity to the Suez Canal, Sudan became both a battlefield and a political experiment in joint administration. Southern Africa, meanwhile, evolved into a theater of economic exploitation and racial hierarchy that would influence the region's future for decades. Egypt's importance to Britain cannot be overstated. In the 19th century, the Suez Canal emerged as one of the most vital maritime shortcuts, linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and dramatically reducing the time required for British ships to reach India, the jewel of the British Empire. Though the canal itself was constructed by the French, Britain swiftly recognized its strategic value. Economic mismanagement by the Khedive of Egypt led to mounting debts, and Britain seized the opportunity by purchasing shares in the Suez Canal Company in 1875. However, growing political instability in Egypt led to the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. Ostensibly sent to restore order and protect European lives and property, British forces ended up occupying Egypt, beginning a period of de facto colonial control that would last for decades, despite Egypt technically remaining an Ottoman province and later a nominally independent state. Under British occupation, Egypt's infrastructure improved, with railways, irrigation systems, and administrative reforms implemented. However, these improvements primarily served imperial interests, facilitating the export of cotton and the movement of military forces. Political power remained in British hands, with the Egyptian ruler, or Khedive, becoming increasingly subordinate. British advisors oversaw key ministries, and dissent was often suppressed. Nationalist movements began to grow, particularly in the early 20th century, challenging the colonial order. The 1919 Egyptian Revolution, driven by widespread frustration with British control and inspired by global trends of self-determination, marked a turning point. Though Britain granted Egypt nominal independence in 1922, it retained significant influence over foreign policy, military matters, and the Suez Canal zone. Sudan presented a different but closely linked case. Initially, the region was part of the Egyptian domain, administered from Cairo with varying degrees of effectiveness. However, the rise of the Mahdist movement in the 1880s, a religious and political revolt against Egyptian and British interference, challenged foreign dominance. Led by Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdists achieved several dramatic victories, including the defeat of Anglo-Egyptian forces at Khartoum in 1885 and the death of General Charles Gordon, a moment that shocked Britain and stirred public sentiment back home. For over a decade, Sudan remained outside foreign control, governed by the Mahdist state. However, the strategic and political need to reassert authority over the region, combined with concerns about French encroachment in Africa, prompted a new British-led campaign. General Herbert Kitchener launched a methodical and brutal reconquest, culminating in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Superior weaponry and tactics allowed British and Egyptian forces to decisively crush the Mahdist forces, re-establishing colonial rule. Following this victory, Sudan was placed under the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, a unique arrangement that theoretically involved joint British and Egyptian administration. In practice, however, Britain wielded overwhelming control. The British sought to prevent the spread of Egyptian nationalism to Sudan and administered it separately, fostering a policy of divide and rule. Educational and administrative systems were crafted to discourage Sudanese identification with Egypt and to reinforce British influence. Economic development focused on cotton cultivation, particularly through projects like the Gezira scheme, which tied Sudanese agriculture to the needs of British textile industries. Sudan's colonial experience was marked by exclusion from political decision-making and a deeply paternalistic approach. The British framed their rule as a civilizing mission, claiming to bring progress to a land ravaged by previous misrule. Yet this rhetoric masked the reality of economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and arbitrary governance. Ethnic and regional divisions were often exacerbated by colonial policies, laying the groundwork for future conflicts that would emerge with devastating consequences after independence. Meanwhile, in southern Africa, the British presence took on a different tone, driven primarily by resource extraction, settler colonization, and geopolitical rivalry. The region had long attracted European interest due to its fertile lands and strategic location, but the discovery of vast mineral wealth in the 19th century transformed the British approach. Diamonds in Kimberley and gold in the Witwatersrand drew thousands of prospectors, settlers, and imperial officials eager to stake their claim. British interests clashed with those of the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had established their own republics, notably the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Tensions between these groups culminated in the Anglo-Boer Wars, particularly the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. This brutal conflict, marked by scorched earth tactics and the use of concentration camps by the British, left deep scars on the region. Though Britain ultimately emerged victorious, it faced criticism both domestically and internationally for its conduct during the war. Following the war, Britain consolidated its hold over the region by establishing the Union of South Africa in 1910, bringing together the former Boer republics and British colonies into a self-governing dominion of the empire. This new political entity was dominated by a white minority, with black South Africans systematically excluded from meaningful participation in governance. British colonial policies in southern Africa increasingly focused on supporting a white settler elite, reinforcing racial hierarchies and codifying discriminatory practices. The British promoted policies that ensured the flow of wealth from African labor and land into colonial coffers. The implementation of pass laws, land dispossession, and labor migration systems ensured a steady supply of cheap African labor for mines and farms. Missionary schools offered limited education, with the goal of creating a subservient class rather than fostering intellectual or political autonomy. British officials often collaborated with local chiefs to maintain order, but these relationships were manipulated to serve colonial interests. Resistance to British rule in southern Africa took many forms. Armed uprisings occurred, such as the Bambatha Rebellion in 1906, which was swiftly and harshly suppressed. Over time, more organized political movements emerged, including the early foundations of what would become the African National Congress. While British administrators claimed to bring order and modernity, they sowed the seeds of long-term social unrest and inequality. The racialized systems established under British rule would later evolve into apartheid, a policy framework formalized by the Afrikaner government but rooted in earlier colonial practices. Throughout their time in Egypt, Sudan, and southern Africa, the British employed a variety of strategies to maintain control: military force, administrative innovation, economic dependency, and cultural manipulation. Though each region had distinct histories and experiences, Common threads connected them: the prioritization of imperial interests over local welfare, the marginalization of native voices, and the enduring legacies of division and exploitation. In Egypt, the British cloaked their domination in the language of protection and modernization, but the underlying motive was control of a critical artery of empire. In Sudan, the justification shifted to one of rescue and reconstruction, yet the result was another chapter of imposed authority and economic extraction. In southern Africa, the narrative centered on civilizing and developing, while in reality building a deeply unequal society that privileged settlers and relegated the indigenous population to second-class status or worse. By the mid-20th century, the winds of decolonization began to sweep across Africa. In Egypt, nationalist forces finally succeeded in pushing out the British, culminating in the 1952 revolution and the withdrawal from the Suez Canal zone by the mid-1950s. In Sudan, independence came in 1956, though the divisions left by colonial rule would later contribute to cycles of civil war. In southern Africa, the legacy of British colonialism persisted far longer, with apartheid only ending in the early 1990s after a long and painful struggle. The story of British colonialism in Egypt, Sudan, and southern Africa is not simply one of conquest and control, but also of enduring impact. These regions were not merely backdrops to imperial ambition. They were active spaces where local people responded, resisted, adapted, and remembered. Today, the physical and psychological scars of colonial rule remain visible in the political borders drawn by colonial authorities, in the economic dependencies established during the empire, and in the cultural and linguistic imprints that still shape national identities. Understanding these histories is essential for grappling with the complexities of the modern post-colonial world, where the past remains deeply entwined with the present. The colonization of Australia, penal colonies, and frontier violence. The colonization of Australia, beginning in 1788, was a profound and often brutal chapter in the history of the British Empire. It was shaped largely by Britain's penal system, its imperial ambitions, and the harsh realities of frontier expansion. Far from being a peaceful settlement, the colonization process was marked by hardship, resistance, and extensive frontier violence. This story is not only one of convicts and colonies, but also of a continent deeply affected by the collision of vastly different cultures and the consequences that followed. When Britain lost its American colonies after the Revolutionary War, it sought a new location to transport its growing population of convicts. British prisons were overcrowded, crime was rising, and public fear of social disorder increased pressure on the government to find a solution. Australia, with its vast and largely uncharted landmass, seemed ideal for this purpose. In 1787, the First Fleet, carrying around 750 convicts alongside Marines and officers, set sail under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip. They arrived at Port Jackson in January 1788 and established what would become the first permanent European settlement on the continent, Sydney. The penal colony at New South Wales was initially a place of extreme hardship. Supplies were limited, the terrain unfamiliar, and relations with the local Aboriginal groups uncertain. Convicts were put to work clearing land, constructing buildings, and farming, all under military supervision. The environment was harsh, and many perished from disease, malnutrition, and the rigors of forced labor. Yet over time, the colony grew. More fleets arrived, bringing additional convicts, settlers, and soldiers. The British government expanded its reach along the coast and further inland, driven by the perceived need to secure the territory against rival European powers and to exploit its resources. As settlements expanded, tensions with the indigenous peoples of Australia, who had lived on the continent for over 60,000 years, intensified. Aboriginal communities with deep spiritual and cultural connections to their land were confronted by foreign structures, fences, and roads. The introduction of livestock by settlers destroyed native plants and disrupted traditional hunting patterns. Water sources were polluted or claimed by the colonists. Disease also spread rapidly as Aboriginal populations had no immunity to the illnesses brought by Europeans. Smallpox outbreaks, in particular, devastated entire communities. The conflict over land and resources soon escalated into outright violence. Aboriginal resistance took many forms, from organized raids on colonial outposts to acts of sabotage against settlers and livestock. These responses were often met with brutal reprisals. Frontier violence became an enduring feature of colonization, with massacres, forced removals, and punitive expeditions conducted by settlers and colonial authorities. These conflicts were not isolated incidents, but a widespread and systemic response to resistance, rooted in the belief that Aboriginal people were obstacles to progress rather than rightful custodians of the land. Throughout the 19th century, the British established new penal settlements in Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania, Western Australia, and Norfolk Island. Each of these regions followed a similar pattern. Convict labor was used to build the infrastructure of colonial administration, and the surrounding indigenous populations were pushed aside, marginalized, or decimated. Tasmania, in particular, became notorious for the violence of its frontier wars. The so-called Black War in the 1820s and 1830s saw widespread conflict between settlers and Aboriginal groups, culminating in one of the most tragic episodes in Australian history. The colonial government's response included the Black Line, a coordinated military operation intended to sweep the Aboriginal population out of settled areas, a campaign that ultimately led to the near genocide of the island's indigenous people. The penal system itself evolved during this period. Initially, transportation to Australia was seen as an alternative to execution or life in prison. Many convicts were guilty of petty crimes, stealing food, clothing, or small sums of money. Once in Australia, their treatment varied depending on their behavior, skills, and the whims of their overseers. Some were assigned to landowners as laborers, while others were placed in chain gangs or harsh penal institutions. Over time, the colony began to grant tickets of leave to convicts who demonstrated good conduct, allowing them a degree of freedom and the opportunity to eventually earn full pardons. Despite its origins, the penal colony grew into a functioning settler society. Free settlers arrived in increasing numbers during the early 1800s, lured by the promise of land and opportunity. These settlers often viewed the convicts as inferior, even as they relied on their labor to establish farms and towns. The colonial government introduced policies encouraging land grants to free settlers, which further intensified the displacement of Indigenous Australians. As European agriculture spread, Aboriginal communities were increasingly confined to missions, reserves, or marginalized in remote areas. Resistance persisted in various forms, from passive non-cooperation to armed conflict. Notable figures like Pemulwuy and Yagan led campaigns against colonists in the early decades, becoming symbols of resistance. However, Aboriginal resistance was rarely recorded or honored in official colonial accounts, and many of their efforts were suppressed or erased from public memory. Only in recent decades has there been a broader acknowledgement of the scale of violence and the resilience of Indigenous Australians during this period. The discovery of gold in the 1850s shifted the colony's trajectory once more. It brought a wave of migrants from around the world and accelerated economic development. With it came a new surge of land appropriation, pushing settlers even deeper into Aboriginal territories. Though transportation of convicts to New South Wales officially ended in 1840 and to Western Australia in 1868, the legacy of the penal system remained. Many former convicts became part of the free population, and their labor had helped lay the foundations of Australia's infrastructure and economy. The myth of peaceful settlement endured for much of Australia's history, reinforced by narratives that glorified pioneers and ignored the violence inflicted on Aboriginal peoples. It was not until the late 20th century that historical research and activism began to challenge this narrative, exposing the reality of massacres, forced removals, and cultural destruction. This reevaluation continues today as Australians grapple with the legacy of colonization and seek to reconcile with the past through acknowledgement, education, and policy reform. In essence, the colonization of Australia was both a penal experiment and a frontier conquest. It was a project rooted in control over land, over people, and over narratives. Convicts, often poor and dispossessed themselves, were used as tools in an imperial venture that dispossessed another group entirely, the Indigenous Australians. The frontier was not merely a boundary between settled and unsettled lands, but a shifting, violent space of cultural collision and survival. Understanding this period requires moving beyond simplistic stories of progress or civilization and confronting the realities of power, resistance, and loss. It demands an honest reflection on the price paid by those whose lands were taken, cultures disrupted, and lives forever changed by colonization. The legacy of penal colonies and frontier violence is not confined to the pages of history books. It is etched into the landscape, the institutions, and the memories that continue to shape Australia today. Ireland and Empire, Rebellion, Famine, and Union. The relationship between Ireland and the British Empire is a complex and emotionally charged chapter in history, marked by centuries of resistance, hardship, and shifting political control. Ireland, located on the western periphery of Europe, became entangled in the web of imperial ambition and governance as England's influence began to expand beyond its borders. From the Tudor conquest to the Act of Union in 1801, and through the devastation of the Great Famine and multiple uprisings, Ireland's story within the empire is one of struggle, identity, and enduring conflict. The roots of English interference in Ireland stretch back to the 12th century, but it was during the reigns of the Tudor monarchs in the 16th century that a concerted effort to assert direct control over the island began. England sought to consolidate its authority using a mixture of military conquest and colonization. The policy of plantation, confiscating land from Irish nobles and settling English and Scottish Protestants in their place, had far-reaching consequences. This sowed the seeds of resentment as native Irish Catholics were dispossessed and marginalized, creating a deep religious and cultural divide that would simmer for centuries. By the 17th century, Ireland had become a focal point in broader religious and political conflicts across the British Isles. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms, particularly the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, were marked by violence and repression. Oliver Cromwell's campaign in Ireland left a legacy of bitterness, especially following the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford, where civilian casualties were high. Land confiscations and the systematic transfer of property from Catholic to Protestant hands reshaped the Irish social landscape, entrenching inequality and feeding long-standing grievances. Despite the harsh realities of English rule, Ireland retained a distinct cultural identity expressed through language, literature, and oral tradition. Gaelic culture, though under constant pressure, persisted in the countryside. Meanwhile, Catholicism remained a defining element of Irish life, especially as legal restrictions sought to curtail its influence. Penal laws, enacted throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, imposed severe limits on Catholics' rights, including land ownership, education, and political participation. These laws institutionalized discrimination and further alienated the majority population from the ruling Protestant minority, most of whom were of English or Scottish descent. Throughout the 18th century, calls for reform grew louder. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the revolutions in America and France, some Irish sought greater autonomy and representation. The late 1700s witnessed growing agitation culminating in the 1798 rebellion. Led by the United Irishmen, a revolutionary group that aimed to unite Catholics and Protestants in the cause of an independent republic, the uprising was met with brutal suppression. Thousands were killed, and the rebellion's failure reinforced British resolve to bring Ireland more fully under imperial control. In 1801, the Act of Union formally merged the Kingdom of Ireland with the Kingdom of Great Britain, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The union was intended to stabilize the island, integrate it politically, and prevent future rebellion. However, the promised benefits of union failed to materialize for much of the Irish population. Catholics were still excluded from political office, and economic disparities remained pronounced. Although the Act granted Irish representatives a presence in the Westminster Parliament, real power remained concentrated in London. The early decades of the 19th century brought momentous changes, particularly with the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which removed many of the remaining legal disabilities faced by Catholics. This was a significant milestone, achieved largely through the efforts of Daniel O'Connell, a prominent political leader who mobilized mass support through nonviolent means. Yet, emancipation, while important, did not solve the deeper structural issues facing Ireland. Land ownership patterns, poverty, and disenfranchisement persisted. Perhaps the most devastating chapter in Ireland's history within the empire was the Great Famine, which struck between 1845 and 1852. A potato blight wiped out the primary food source for millions of Irish peasants, many of whom relied almost exclusively on the crop for sustenance. The failure of successive harvests, combined with inadequate and often callous responses from the British government, turned a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and another million emigrated, many to North America. Entire villages were emptied, and the social fabric of rural Ireland was torn apart. The famine exposed the vulnerabilities of a society deeply embedded in colonial structures. Irish tenant farmers, renting from absentee British landlords, had few protections. Relief efforts were hampered by political ideologies that prioritized market forces and self-reliance over intervention. The British government's response, characterized by workhouses, soup kitchens, and limited aid, was widely seen as insufficient and indifferent. The trauma of the famine left a deep scar on Irish collective memory, intensifying anti-British sentiment and further radicalizing nationalist movements. In the wake of the famine, Ireland underwent profound demographic, social, and political shifts. The population, which had been over 8 million before the famine, continued to decline for decades due to emigration and falling birth rates. The Irish diaspora, particularly in the United States, became a powerful voice for Irish nationalism abroad. At home, the call for land reform gained urgency. The land war of the late 19th century saw tenant farmers organizing to demand fair rents and secure tenures, often clashing with landlords and the police. These campaigns eventually led to significant reforms, including the gradual transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants. The cultural revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries played a crucial role in reasserting Irish identity. Movements, such as the Gaelic League, sought to preserve and promote the Irish language and traditions, while writers, poets, and artists infused their work with nationalist themes. This cultural resurgence was closely linked with political developments, as new leaders emerged advocating for home rule, limited self-government within the empire. However, efforts to pass home rule legislation were repeatedly blocked or delayed, frustrating hopes for peaceful change. This prolonged delay, combined with growing impatience among younger and more radical elements, led to further conflict. The Easter Rising of 1916, though initially unpopular, became a turning point. British forces suppressed the rebellion quickly and executed its leaders, but public opinion shifted dramatically in its aftermath. The rise of Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army marked a new phase of armed struggle. The subsequent War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1921, resulted in the partition of Ireland. The Anglo-Irish Treaty created the Irish Free State, a self-governing dominion within the British Commonwealth, while 6 counties in the north remained part of the United Kingdom. The partition left a lasting legacy. While the South embarked on a path toward full independence, Northern Ireland remained tethered to Britain, setting the stage for further conflict. The division entrenched sectarian divisions, particularly in the north, where Protestant and Catholic communities lived side by side in uneasy proximity. Though the Irish Free State would eventually become a fully sovereign republic, the scars of empire and the realities of division continued to shape Irish politics and society. Throughout this turbulent history, Ireland's experience within the British Empire was marked by a unique combination of internal resistance and external domination. The island was never treated as a distant colony, but rather as a troubled neighbor, close enough to demand control, but distinct enough to resist it. Unlike colonies in Africa or Asia, Ireland's colonization involved both conquest and integration, exploitation and shared governance, leading to an especially complicated relationship with imperial power. Irish contributions to the British Empire were not limited to suffering or resistance. Many Irishmen served in the British Army, and Irish labor helped fuel the industrial and economic engine of the empire, yet this participation often came from a place of necessity rather than allegiance. For many, joining the empire's military or emigrating to its farthest reaches was a means of survival rather than choice. The Irish presence across the empire, from India to Canada to Australia, reflected a diaspora shaped by trauma and opportunity alike. Today, the legacy of Ireland's time under British rule remains a potent subject of discussion and debate. Monuments, literature, and education all reflect a continuing negotiation of history. In recent years, efforts to reconcile the shared past have increased, yet the wounds of empire are not easily forgotten. Ireland's story, its rebellions, famines, and union with a larger political entity, continues to resonate as a cautionary tale about the costs of domination and the resilience of cultural identity. In examining Ireland's historical journey, one cannot overlook the duality of suffering and survival. Its people endured conquest, starvation, and systemic marginalization, yet they preserved their traditions, adapted to changing circumstances, and asserted their right to self-determination. The Irish experience within the British Empire is not a singular tale of victimhood, but a testament to endurance. It is a narrative that holds both pain and pride, one that helped shape the course of Irish nationhood and influenced the broader story of decolonization across the world. The British in the Middle East, oil, mandates, and modern borders. The involvement of the British in the Middle East during the early 20th century marked a pivotal shift in the political, economic, and social structures of the region. At the heart of this transformation lay three interwoven forces: the pursuit of oil, the imposition of colonial mandates, and the redrawing of borders that would shape the modern Middle East. As the Ottoman Empire began to collapse in the wake of World War I, Britain moved rapidly to fill the void, driven by a mixture of imperial ambition, strategic necessity, and the growing importance of petroleum in modern warfare and industry. What unfolded was a complex and often contentious era that laid the foundations for many of the tensions that persist in the Middle East to this day. Britain's interest in the Middle East initially emerged from strategic considerations tied to imperial trade routes, especially the path to India. The Suez Canal, which came under British control in 1882, was a critical artery connecting Britain to its empire in the east. However, it wasn't until the discovery of oil in Persia, modern-day Iran, in 1908, that the Middle East took on a dramatically new significance. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later evolved into British Petroleum, BP, gave Britain access to an essential energy source that would become increasingly central to both military and industrial power. This early involvement in Persia demonstrated how British policy in the region would be driven by access to oil resources, an element that only grew more critical with time. As World War I raged, the British Empire saw the opportunity to undermine its Ottoman adversaries by forging alliances with local Arab leaders. This culminated in the infamous McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, in which Britain promised support for an independent Arab state in exchange for an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. At the same time, however, Britain entered into the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, dividing the Ottoman territories of the Middle East into spheres of influence for European powers. This duplicity would come to haunt post-war diplomacy, as Arab leaders who had supported the British war effort found themselves sidelined in the imperial carve-up that followed the conflict. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations granted Britain mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. These mandates were justified under the guise of preparing these territories for eventual independence, but in practice they extended British colonial control. In Iraq, British forces faced immediate resistance from local populations who resented foreign domination. The 1920 Iraqi Revolt was a significant uprising that demonstrated the limits of British authority and forced the British government to reconsider its approach. Rather than direct rule, Britain supported a monarchy under King Faisal, hoping this would placate nationalist sentiments while still ensuring British interests, especially in oil, were protected. Oil played a decisive role in British involvement in Iraq. The Mosul region, in particular, was rich in petroleum, and Britain worked to ensure that it remained within Iraq's borders under their mandate. The creation of the Iraq Petroleum Company, in which Britain held a controlling interest, ensured that the flow of oil would benefit British industries and fuel the Royal Navy, which had recently transitioned from coal to oil. Control over these oil fields wasn't simply about profit. It was about maintaining Britain's status as a global power in the increasingly mechanized world of the 20th century. In Palestine, the British faced a very different set of challenges. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, introduced a complex and volatile dynamic. Jewish immigration increased during the British Mandate, provoking resistance from the Arab population who feared displacement and the loss of their land. Britain found itself caught between two conflicting national movements, and attempts to balance both interests often led to frustration, violence, and accusations of betrayal from both sides. The tensions that began under British rule in Palestine would ultimately escalate into a long-standing conflict that continues to shape regional politics. The drawing of modern borders under British supervision often ignored the ethnic, religious, and tribal realities on the ground. In many cases, artificial boundaries grouped together communities with little shared identity, while splitting apart others with deep historical ties. The borders of Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine were all products of British decisions made with imperial convenience in mind, rather than the aspirations of the people living there. These borders have since become flashpoints for conflict as nationalist and sectarian tensions emerged in the wake of independence movements and decolonization. In Transjordan, Britain established the Hashemite kingdom under Emir Abdullah, the brother of Faisal. This was partially a reward for the Hashemite family's support during the war, but also a strategic decision to maintain friendly monarchies in the region that would align with British interests. Transjordan remained a relatively quiet mandate compared to Palestine and Iraq, but British influence was ever present, particularly in military and administrative matters. The British trained and financed the Arab Legion, which became a key force in the region and played a central role in regional conflicts, including the Arab-Israeli wars that followed. The British presence in the Middle East was not without its detractors back home. The cost of maintaining military forces, the frequent unrest in mandate territories, and the moral complexities of imperial rule in an increasingly anti-colonial world made the British role in the Middle East a subject of domestic debate. Nonetheless, strategic interests continued to dominate policy. The region's proximity to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, combined with the necessity of securing oil supplies, meant that Britain remained deeply entangled in Middle Eastern affairs even after the formal end of its mandates. The withdrawal from Palestine in 1948 marked a turning point. Unable to contain the escalating conflict between Jewish and Arab communities, Britain handed over the issue to the newly formed United Nations. The decision to withdraw without a lasting political solution led to the first Arab-Israeli war and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Britain's exit from Palestine revealed the limits of imperial power in a changing world and foreshadowed the broader process of decolonization that would soon unfold across the British Empire. In the post-mandate period, Britain attempted to maintain its influence through a combination of military alliances, arms sales, and economic partnerships. In Iran, Britain continued to exert control over oil through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company until the nationalization of oil under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in the early 1950s. This move led to a crisis that ultimately saw British and American intelligence services orchestrate a coup to remove Mossadegh, reestablishing a pro-Western monarchy under the Shah. The episode reinforced the centrality of oil in British policy and the lengths to which Britain would go to maintain access. Despite these efforts, British power in the Middle East continued to decline. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was perhaps the most dramatic example of this. When Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military operation to regain control. However, international condemnation, particularly from the United States, forced a humiliating withdrawal. The crisis exposed the extent to which Britain had become dependent on American support and signaled the end of Britain's role as the dominant power in the region. Still, Britain maintained economic ties and military relationships throughout the Gulf and broader Middle East. Bases in places like Bahrain and agreements with Gulf monarchies allowed Britain to maintain a presence, albeit reduced from the days of direct control. The discovery of vast oil reserves in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates shifted the center of oil power in the region, and while Britain no longer held monopolistic control, its companies and political influence remained embedded in the region's development. The legacy of British involvement in the Middle East is deeply contested. To some, it represents a period of exploitation, where resources were extracted and local populations were manipulated for imperial gain. To others, it laid the foundations for modernization through infrastructure, education, and administrative institutions, even if those developments served colonial purposes at the time. What is undeniable is that British decisions during the Mandate period helped shape the borders, conflicts, and alliances that still define the modern Middle East. By drawing borders without regard to historical divisions, and by prioritizing imperial interests over self-determination, Britain contributed to a legacy of instability. The favoring of certain elites over popular movements slowed divisions, and the use of military force to suppress dissent left scars that would influence future relations with Western powers. The centrality of oil ensured that external powers would remain involved in the region, but the shift from British to American dominance in the second half of the 20th century changed the nature of that involvement. In sum, Britain's role in the Middle East was a complex tapestry of ambition, strategy, and resource exploitation. It was marked by promises made and broken, lines drawn in sand, and alliances that shifted with changing priorities. While the British Empire may have retreated, the political and territorial frameworks it left behind continue to shape the destinies of nations across the Middle East. Understanding this history is essential for grasping the roots of many of the region's current challenges and the enduring impact of imperial power in a region where past and present are inextricably linked. The Scramble for America, British colonization of the 13 colonies. The colonization of North America by the British was not an overnight endeavor. It was a slow, deliberate, and often desperate process driven by ambition, faith, economics, and the thirst for imperial dominance. As European powers turned their gaze across the Atlantic, Britain found itself compelled to join the race for territory, prestige, and profit. Unlike the conquests of Spain and Portugal, the British approach was less about gold and immediate plunder and more about settlement, agriculture, and long-term influence. The founding of the 13 colonies would be a patchwork of various motives, people, and experiences, ultimately laying the foundations for a new nation. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, England was undergoing significant changes. Religious conflict, population growth, economic transition, and a competitive urge to match the wealth of other European powers pushed the English crown and its supporters toward overseas ventures. The dream of finding a passage to the riches of Asia, combined with tales of vast resources and fertile land in the New World, ignited the imagination of explorers and investors alike. Early attempts, such as the ill-fated Roanoke colony, ended in mystery and failure, but they also hardened England's resolve to succeed. Jamestown, established in 1607 in what would become Virginia, was the first permanent English settlement in North America. Sponsored by the Virginia Company, a joint stock venture, it embodied the spirit of profit-driven colonization. The settlers, unaccustomed to the harsh realities of wilderness survival, struggled through famine, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. The colony's survival was made possible by the cultivation of tobacco, a crop that became the economic backbone of the southern colonies. Tobacco not only brought wealth, but also created a labor demand that would lead to the entrenchment of indentured servitude and, eventually, African slavery. As England's foothold grew firmer, other colonies followed. Religious dissenters played a major role in shaping the character of several northern settlements. In 1620, the Pilgrims, seeking freedom from persecution, arrived aboard the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. 10 years later, the more organized and better-funded Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These communities were deeply religious, structured, and aimed to create what they considered a city upon a hill, a moral example for the world. Their faith shaped everything from governance to education, and their insistence on moral purity often led to the persecution of dissenters, many of whom moved to establish new colonies. Thus, Rhode Island was born, a haven for religious freedom under the leadership of Roger Williams. Similarly, Connecticut and New Hampshire emerged as offshoots of Puritan dissatisfaction, each colony developing its own system of governance and religious practice. The northern colonies began to build an identity distinct from the southern ones, marked by small-scale farming, town meetings, and a more egalitarian social structure, at least among landowning men. Meanwhile, the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, developed with a blend of influences. Originally settled by the Dutch as New Netherland, the region was taken by the British in 1664 and renamed New York. Its diversity and strategic location made it a bustling hub of trade and immigration. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a refuge for Quakers, emphasized tolerance, peace, and good relations with native tribes. The fertile land and navigable rivers in the region encouraged grain farming and fostered a mixed economy of agriculture and commerce. These colonies attracted a wide array of settlers, Germans, Swedes, Scots-Irish, and others, adding to their pluralistic culture. The southern colonies, stretching from Maryland to Georgia, had an economy deeply rooted in plantation agriculture. Maryland, founded as a haven for English Catholics, quickly became dominated by tobacco cultivation. Carolina, originally chartered as one colony, later split into North and South Carolina due to geographical and economic differences. South Carolina, with its rice and indigo plantations, became one of the wealthiest and most aristocratic of the colonies. Georgia, the last to be established, was founded as both a buffer against Spanish Florida and a social experiment, providing a new start for debtors and the poor. Throughout this colonial expansion, British authorities maintained varying degrees of control. Early on, most colonies operated under charters granted by the Crown or trading companies. Over time, however, the Crown began to exert more direct authority through royal governors and oversight, especially in economically valuable or politically unstable regions. Still, a pattern of self-governance took root. Colonial assemblies composed of landowning men handled local matters and increasingly demanded autonomy, planting the seeds of future resistance. The British colonists also had to contend with complex relationships with Native American tribes. While some leaders pursued diplomacy and trade, others relied on displacement and violence. Conflicts like King Philip's War in New England and the Yamasee War in the South revealed the deepening tensions as English expansion encroached on indigenous land. These wars were brutal and transformative, often resulting in the loss of life, territory, and cultural stability for Native communities. Nevertheless, alliances were also forged, and the fur trade became an economic bridge in many regions. Economically, the colonies evolved to serve British mercantilist goals. Laws such as the Navigation Acts restricted colonial trade to favor English merchants and ensured that wealth flowed back to the mother country. Raw materials like tobacco, timber, furs, and later cotton were exported to England, while manufactured goods were imported in return. This system enriched the empire but also created economic frustrations among colonists, especially as they grew more prosperous and ambitious. Education, religion, and culture flourished in the colonies in ways both reflective of and distinct from the English homeland. Harvard, the first college in British America, was founded in 1636 to train Puritan ministers. Print culture began to take hold, with newspapers, pamphlets, and books spreading ideas rapidly. Religious revivals, such as the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 1740s, stirred passionate movements across the colonies, emphasizing personal faith and challenging established churches. This spiritual upheaval had social and political consequences, encouraging individual judgment and questioning of authority. By the mid-18th century, the British colonies in North America had grown substantially in population, wealth, and complexity. They stretched along the Atlantic coast from the rocky shores of New England to the swamps of Georgia. Each had its own character, shaped by geography, settlers, economic goals, and cultural priorities. Yet, they were all tied together by language, legal traditions, and allegiance, however strained, to the British Crown. The colonization process had not been seamless. Disease, starvation, war, and political conflict marked much of the early experience. However, the persistence of settlers, the lure of land, and the drive for religious and economic freedom pushed the boundaries of British America ever westward. What began as a scattered group of struggling outposts had grown into a vibrant and diverse society that, while still tethered to Britain, was beginning to see itself as something distinct. The competition with other European empires also shaped the colony's development. French and Spanish claims to nearby lands meant that the British colonies often felt vulnerable, leading to the construction of forts, local militias, and a growing military presence. Wars fought in Europe frequently spilled into North America. The 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, was a turning point. British victory eliminated French competition, but also plunged the empire into debt, prompting new taxes and regulations on the colonies, setting the stage for a dramatic transformation. In the decades to come, the same colonies that had once scrambled for survival, land, and freedom would challenge their imperial overseers. The skills in self-governance, the economic aspirations, and the cultural independence that had developed over more than a century would converge into a movement for something unheard of at the time: independence. But before that moment, the story of British colonization of the 13 colonies stands as a testament to human resilience, ambition, and the complex interplay of forces that shaped the early history of what would become the United States. The Victorian Empire: expansion, morality, and paradox. The Victorian Empire emerged as one of the most extensive and powerful empires in human history. Stretching across continents and oceans, it came to define much of the global political and economic landscape of the 19th century. Under Queen Victoria's reign, the British Empire expanded its territories in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas, reinforcing its dominance through both military might and intricate political maneuvering. But this rapid expansion was not just a story of conquest and control. It was also a complex web of moral contradictions, lofty ideals, and deeply entrenched paradoxes that continue to provoke reflection to this day. At the heart of the Victorian Empire lay a strong belief in its own civilizing mission. British officials and intellectuals often claimed that they were bringing progress, order, and enlightenment to societies they considered backward or primitive. Schools were established, railways constructed, administrative systems imposed, and the English language spread across the globe. All of this was seen by many in Britain as part of a benevolent effort to uplift and modernize colonized peoples. Yet this narrative was frequently at odds with the actual experiences of those who lived under imperial rule. For millions of subjects, the empire did not bring enlightenment but subjugation. It did not deliver prosperity but economic exploitation and cultural suppression. The expansion of the empire was driven by a mixture of strategic ambition, commercial interest, and ideological conviction. In India, the East India Company's gradual conquest gave way to direct crown rule after the 1857 rebellion, reshaping the subcontinent into the jewel of the empire. British officials extolled the virtues of law and order while simultaneously dismantling traditional structures and suppressing dissent with often brutal force. In Africa, British incursions were framed as efforts to stop the slave trade and bring civilization, yet these same efforts opened the door to resource extraction and control over native populations. Throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, British presence was marked by the same blend of missionary zeal and economic opportunism, blurring the lines between liberation and domination. One of the most striking paradoxes of the Victorian Empire was its simultaneous embrace of moral superiority and its participation in morally questionable practices. British abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century was hailed as a triumph of moral vision. The Royal Navy patrolled the seas to intercept slave ships, and Britain positioned itself as a global champion of human rights. However, this moral high ground was undermined by the empire's continued reliance on exploitative labor systems, such as indentured servitude, particularly in colonies like the Caribbean, South Africa, and Fiji. Workers from India and China were transported in harsh conditions and subjected to poor treatment, creating a new form of coerced labor that mimicked many of the abuses the empire claimed to be eradicating. Religion played a powerful role in justifying imperial expansion. Christian missionaries followed imperial administrators into remote territories, seeking to convert indigenous populations and reshape local cultures. Missionary schools often replaced traditional forms of education, and religious instruction was used to inculcate British values. Yet, while many missionaries believed sincerely in their cause, the impact of their work often meant the erosion of native spiritual practices, customs, and community structures. For every school built or hospital opened, there was a corresponding loss of cultural heritage and identity among colonized peoples. The Victorian ethos of improvement and moral elevation was steeped in a conviction of cultural superiority, which led to profound consequences for those on the receiving end. Domestically, the Victorian era was marked by significant industrial growth, urbanization, and social reform. These developments were often seen as proof of British progress and justification for the empire, but they also stood in stark contrast to the conditions within the empire itself. While reformers at home fought for labor rights, public health, and education, similar concerns abroad were often neglected or actively suppressed. The empire was expected to enrich Britain, not to mirror its evolving standards of justice and equity. Consequently, many colonial subjects remained under systems of governance that allowed little voice, few protections, and limited economic benefit. In this way, the empire became a mirror reflecting not just British ambition, but also British inconsistency. The Victorian period was also a time of immense scientific and technological advancement, much of which was harnessed in service of the empire. Steamships, telegraphs, and railways connected distant parts of the globe, enabling the faster movement of troops, goods, and information. Maps were drawn, surveys conducted, and knowledge cataloged in an effort to better understand and control the vast imperial holdings. This newfound mastery over the physical world fed into the imperial ideology of control and rational order. But it also raised ethical dilemmas. Science was often used to justify racial hierarchies and to support the idea that British rule was both natural and necessary. Anthropologists, biologists, and explorers sometimes portrayed colonized peoples as inferior or childlike, requiring the firm hand of imperial guidance. Yet, despite the image of control, the Victorian Empire was frequently unstable and contested. Rebellions, uprisings, and resistance movements were common features of the imperial landscape. From the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to the Zulu War, from the Mahdist uprising in Sudan to countless smaller acts of defiance, imperial authority was regularly challenged. These acts of resistance revealed the limits of British power and the unwillingness of many colonized people to passively accept foreign domination. In response, British forces often resorted to overwhelming violence, reinforcing the very fears that had fueled resistance in the first place. The empire thus found itself in a cycle of conquest and conflict, stability and suppression, a cycle that exposed the fragility beneath the facade of imperial grandeur. Victorian literature, too, played a role in shaping public attitudes toward the empire. Popular novels, travel journals, and adventure stories depicted distant lands as exotic, dangerous, and in need of taming. Writers like Rudyard Kipling glorified the empire's mission with phrases like the white man's burden, presenting imperialism as a noble and sacrificial endeavor. But others, including Charles Dickens and Joseph Conrad, hinted at the darker truths behind the imperial project, revealing the violence, hypocrisy, and internal contradictions that plagued it. In the public imagination, the empire was both a source of pride and a subject of unease, a paradox that ran through much of Victorian thought. Women also played complex roles within the empire. While largely excluded from formal power, British women in colonial settings were often tasked with upholding cultural standards and acting as agents of civilization. They ran schools, engaged in missionary work, and sought to instill Victorian values in local communities. Yet they, too, operated within a deeply patriarchal framework, both at home and abroad. Their presence in the colonies sometimes reinforced racial and gender hierarchies, even as they challenged them in other ways. The story of empire was thus not only about men in pitch helmets and military uniforms, but also about women navigating their own limited spheres of influence in a world of empire. The economic foundations of the Victorian Empire were equally paradoxical. While the empire was justified in moral and civilizational terms, its underlying logic was often one of extraction and profit, Raw materials flowed from the colonies to British factories, while manufactured goods were shipped back to colonial markets. This system enriched Britain, but often left local economies distorted and dependent. Traditional industries were undermined, local crafts marginalized, and agricultural systems reoriented toward cash crops at the expense of food security. In places like India, this dynamic contributed to devastating famines, where imperial priorities took precedence over human needs. The wealth that built the splendor of Victorian Britain often came at a staggering human cost in the colonies. Perhaps most telling of all is the way the empire became a central part of British identity during the Victorian era. The Union Jack flew over vast swaths of territory, and maps of the world shaded in red gave the illusion of permanence and unity. Empire festivals, exhibitions, and public ceremonies celebrated imperial achievements and taught generations of Britons to take pride in their global dominance. But beneath this surface of confidence lay deep contradictions. The empire's promises of justice, order, and moral leadership often clashed with its practices of violence, exclusion, and inequality. As the Victorian era drew to a close, these tensions became increasingly difficult to ignore. In the end, the Victorian Empire was a vast and often contradictory enterprise, an entity built on both ideals and exploitation, on visions of progress and practices of control. It reshaped the world in profound ways, leaving legacies that are still felt today. Yet it also left behind a record of contradictions that continue to challenge our understanding of history. The paradox of an empire that preached liberty while imposing rule, that claimed moral leadership while fostering inequality, remains one of the most enduring and difficult legacies of the Victorian age. The fall of the British Raj, Indian independence, and partition. The twilight of the British Raj was marked by a potent mixture of political determination, communal unrest, and the irreversible tide of history. For nearly 2 centuries, the British Empire had maintained control over the Indian subcontinent, embedding itself into the economic, administrative, and social fabric of the region. However, by the mid-20th century, the machinery of colonialism had begun to falter. The very foundations of British rule were shaken by global shifts in power, growing nationalist aspirations within India, and the harsh realities imposed by the Second World War. The eventual collapse of British authority did not come as a single dramatic act, but rather as a drawn-out unraveling marked by negotiations, protests, and, tragically, violent divisions. The end of British rule in India was deeply tied to both internal and external pressures. The rise of Indian nationalism had gained significant momentum by the early 20th century, spearheaded by figures who challenged imperial authority through nonviolent resistance and moral force. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi transformed the Indian National Congress from an elite debating society into a mass movement that mobilized millions. Through methods such as civil disobedience and the Salt March, the Congress demonstrated the unsustainable nature of British control. Simultaneously, the Muslim League, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, voiced the growing concerns of Muslims who feared marginalization in a Hindu-majority independent India. The British found themselves caught between these powerful forces, neither willing to grant full independence on the terms demanded, nor able to contain the swell of political pressure building across the subcontinent. World War II served as a catalyst that hastened the decline of British imperial authority. The war drained Britain of financial resources and exposed the vulnerability of its empire. Indian support for the war was not unconditional, and the failure of the British to grant immediate independence in exchange for military cooperation only deepened existing resentments. The Quit India movement, launched in 1942, called for an end to British rule with unprecedented urgency. Although it was brutally suppressed, the movement demonstrated the readiness of Indians to challenge colonial power, even in the midst of global conflict. The loyalty of Indian soldiers who fought for the British crown in distant theaters of war only made the demand for independence more compelling upon their return. As the war ended, Britain's weakened state became increasingly apparent. The Labour Party's victory in the 1945 British general elections brought to power a government more inclined toward decolonization. British policymakers, already overwhelmed by the demands of post-war reconstruction at home, recognized that holding on to India would be both politically untenable and economically disastrous. Negotiations began in earnest, though they were fraught with complexities and opposing visions for the future of the subcontinent. At the heart of the debate was the question of unity versus division. The Indian National Congress advocated for a unified India, whereas the Muslim League insisted on a separate homeland for Muslims, what would become Pakistan. This fundamental disagreement escalated as the prospect of British withdrawal grew nearer. Communal violence erupted in several regions, especially in Bengal and Punjab, where populations were more evenly mixed. These clashes underscored the depth of mistrust between religious communities and convinced many that coexistence within a single nation-state might be impossible. British efforts to mediate a power-sharing arrangement proved futile. As deadlines loomed, Viceroy Lord Mountbatten was dispatched to oversee the final transition. With limited time and a volatile situation on the ground, he proposed advancing the timeline for independence, effectively pushing through the process with breathtaking speed. In June 1947, the British government announced its intention to leave India by mid-August of that year. This abrupt deadline left little room for carefully managed transition. The Radcliffe Line, hastily drawn by a British lawyer with limited knowledge of Indian geography or culture, was meant to demarcate the borders of India and Pakistan. Its unveiling just days before independence led to chaos, as communities discovered overnight that they were now residents of a new and, in some cases, hostile state. This partition created a colossal human tragedy. Millions of people were uprooted from their homes in the largest mass migration in recorded history. Trains packed with refugees traveled in both directions, often arriving as ghostly vessels filled with the dead. The violence that accompanied partition was unprecedented. Entire villages were razed, families separated, and neighborhoods turned into battlefields. Religious identity became a matter of life and death. In the midst of this upheaval, both India and Pakistan were born in blood and trauma. Estimates suggest that up to 1 million people died during this period, and countless others were wounded or lost everything they owned. Neither new government was prepared for the humanitarian catastrophe that followed, and the scars left by partition have endured across generations. Amid the tragedy, however, emerged a moment of profound transformation. On August 15, 1947, India and Pakistan both declared independence. In New Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru delivered his iconic Tryst with Destiny speech, evoking the long and painful journey that had led to freedom. Across the border, Jinnah addressed the Pakistani nation, emphasizing unity, tolerance, and justice. These speeches, though born of differing visions, shared a common desire for self-determination and national dignity. The colonial yoke had been cast off, and a new chapter in South Asian history had begun. The departure of the British marked the formal end of the Raj, but the legacies of colonial rule did not vanish overnight. India inherited a political system rooted in British parliamentary traditions, a bureaucratic apparatus that still bore the marks of its colonial creators, and a deeply divided society scarred by decades of imperial manipulation. In Pakistan, the challenges were even more immediate. As a newly formed state, it faced the monumental task of building governance structures, absorbing refugees, and crafting a national identity out of fragmented regional and ethnic affiliations. Both countries, though free from foreign domination, would struggle with the long shadow cast by their shared colonial past. Despite the enormous cost of partition, independence offered both nations a chance to chart their own destinies. India, under Nehru, embarked on a path of secularism, industrial development, and non-alignment in global politics. Pakistan, meanwhile, navigated its own trajectory, shaped by the centrality of Islam in public life and an ongoing debate about the role of military and civilian authority. Over time, both nations experienced internal conflicts, wars with one another, and dramatic political shifts. Yet each also demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of these challenges. The end of British rule, while painful, had created space for self-governance, national pride, and regional transformation. The fall of the British Raj also had implications beyond the Indian subcontinent. It signaled the accelerating decline of European colonial empires around the world. The moral force of India's independence struggle inspired decolonization movements in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. Leaders from various continents looked to India's experience as a model of resistance and renewal. In many ways, the Indian story became a cornerstone in the global dismantling of empire. The narrative of a colonized people regaining control of their own future challenged the legitimacy of imperialism and ushered in a new era of post-colonial identity. For Britain, the loss of India was both a symbolic and strategic blow. Often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the empire, India had long been a source of wealth, military manpower, and global prestige. Its departure forced a reckoning within British society about the sustainability and morality of empire. Although Britain maintained influence in global affairs, it was clear that the age of imperial domination had come to an end. The post-war years saw a rapid decline in colonial holdings, with independence granted to numerous territories over the following decades. The British Empire, once the largest the world had known, was giving way to a Commonwealth of independent nations. Looking back, the fall of the British Raj remains a moment of immense complexity. It represents liberation and loss, triumph and trauma. The road to independence was neither smooth nor without cost. It was shaped by years of struggle, negotiation, and conflict, and culminated in one of the most significant events of the 20th century. While freedom was ultimately achieved, the way in which it came, through division and bloodshed, continues to haunt the collective memory of the region. The partition not only redrew political boundaries, but also redefined identities, histories, and relationships. The lessons of the end of the Raj are enduring. They caution against the dangers of delayed reform, the consequences of political inflexibility, and the destructive power of sectarianism. At the same time, they affirm the strength of popular movements, the value of inclusive governance, and the necessity of addressing historical grievances with wisdom and foresight. As India and Pakistan continue to evolve, the echoes of 1947 remain embedded in their societies, shaping their politics, their narratives, and their place in the world. Today, the legacy of that moment is visible in the vibrant democracies, complex identities, and enduring rivalries that define the region. The fall of the British Raj was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new and ongoing chapter in South Asian history, one written by its own people in their own voices, with all the hope, pain, and power that self-determination entails. Opium and Empire, British Rule in China, and the Unequal Treaties. The story of British rule in China, though indirect and never formally colonial like in India, represents one of the most profound examples of economic domination and coercive diplomacy in modern history. At the center of this tale lies a commodity that would come to symbolize exploitation and moral ambiguity: opium. The British East India Company, already established as a formidable trading power in Asia, faced a mounting trade deficit with China by the late 18th century. Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain were in high demand in Britain, but the Qing dynasty had little interest in European manufactured goods. This imbalance led the British to seek an alternative that would serve both as a trade equalizer and a tool of influence. Opium, cultivated in British-controlled India, provided a perfect, if morally fraught, solution. Illegally smuggled into China despite official bans, opium became both a lucrative enterprise for British merchants and a devastating plague on Chinese society. By the early 19th century, millions of Chinese had become addicted, causing significant social, economic, and administrative problems for the Qing government. The Chinese authorities, alarmed by the widening societal impact, undertook stronger measures to clamp down on the opium trade. One such effort culminated in 1839 when Commissioner Lin Zexu famously confiscated and destroyed large quantities of British opium in Canton. Rather than resolving the crisis through diplomacy, Britain used this as a pretext to initiate military intervention, beginning the First Opium War. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was less a traditional war between empires and more a series of military skirmishes that exposed the stark imbalance of technological and naval power between Britain and then the Qing dynasty. British steam-powered gunboats and modern artillery overwhelmed Chinese defenses, laying bare the vulnerability of an empire that had long isolated itself from global technological and industrial change. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the first of what would later be collectively called the Unequal Treaties. These agreements forced China into a humiliating series of concessions. Among them was the cession of Hong Kong to Britain, the opening of several treaty ports to British merchants, and the granting of extraterritorial rights to British citizens, meaning they were not subject to Chinese law while in China. The Treaty of Nanking marked a turning point in Chinese history. It effectively opened the floodgates for further foreign intervention and economic exploitation. Other Western powers, observing Britain's success, soon followed suit. France, the United States, and Russia pressured China into signing similar treaties, further eroding the sovereignty of the Qing state. British influence, though still technically confined to trade and diplomatic privileges, began to deeply penetrate the political and economic fabric of China. British consuls wielded disproportionate influence in treaty ports, and British merchants came to dominate key sectors of commerce, particularly opium, textiles, and shipping. Despite the treaty, tensions did not subside. The continuation of the opium trade, combined with Chinese resistance to further concessions, eventually led to the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. This conflict, again initiated by disputes involving British merchants and Chinese officials, reinforced Britain's commitment to securing its economic interests through military means. Allied with France, Britain launched a more aggressive campaign that resulted in the occupation of Beijing and the looting and burning of the Summer Palace, an act that remains a deeply painful historical memory for many Chinese people. The war ended with the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860. These agreements imposed even more humiliating terms on China. They opened additional ports to foreign trade, legalized the opium trade, and permitted foreign legations in Beijing, ending China's long-held policy of restricting diplomatic presence to the southern port city of Canton. More significantly, these treaties institutionalized the unequal relationship between China and the Western powers, particularly Britain, which now held a dominant position in shaping Chinese external policy and internal administration within treaty ports. The impact of British rule and the opium economy was profound. The forced acceptance of opium not only deepened the health crisis in China, but also inflicted long-term damage on the Qing economy. Silver, used to purchase opium, drained from the Chinese treasury, weakening the state's fiscal capacity and its ability to maintain infrastructure, military forces, and administrative coherence. The Qing government, already stretched thin by internal rebellions and administrative inefficiencies, found itself unable to mount a sustainable resistance to foreign encroachment. Meanwhile, British merchants and officials enriched themselves, protected by naval power and legal immunities, while evading moral responsibility for the human cost of the trade. The consequences of British actions in China reverberated far beyond the 19th century. Politically, the Qing dynasty never fully recovered its authority after the twin blows of the Opium Wars. The perception of a weak, compromised imperial government fueled domestic unrest, leading to a series of uprisings, including the catastrophic Taiping Rebellion, which left millions dead. Economically, the influx of foreign goods and dominance of foreign merchants undermined local industries and stifled economic innovation. Socially, the opium addiction crisis corroded the health and productivity of entire communities, deepening public resentment toward both foreign powers and the ineffectual Qing leadership. British rule in China, though never officially colonial, followed many of the same patterns seen in formal colonies elsewhere. The imposition of extraterritorial rights, the monopolization of key trade commodities, and the use of military force to compel economic compliance all reflected a system designed to prioritize imperial interests over local well-being. The British justification for these actions often relied on the rhetoric of free trade and civilizational advancement. Yet the reality on the ground was one of coercion, exploitation, and moral contradiction. The so-called civilizing mission rang hollow when it was tied to the promotion of a narcotic that had been banned in Britain itself. As the 19th century wore on, British influence in China only deepened. Railways, customs houses, and banks operated with British capital and under British supervision. British advisors and engineers became fixtures in various reform projects, shaping China's infrastructure and economic policies to align with foreign interests. While some Chinese reformers welcomed the technical expertise and industrial knowledge that came with this exchange, many others saw it as a continuation of foreign domination. This period sowed the seeds of anti-imperialist sentiment that would later shape the Chinese nationalist movement and the eventual push to reclaim sovereignty. The legacy of British rule in China cannot be confined to the treaties and conflicts of the 19th century. It represents a broader story of how economic imperialism can exert control over a sovereign nation without direct colonization. Through a combination of commercial manipulation, military force, and legal coercion, Britain carved out a privileged position in Chinese territory, one that persisted into the 20th century and shaped the trajectory of Chinese politics, society, and foreign relations. The opium trade, far from being a footnote in this story, was the vehicle through which much of this control was exercised, and its effects are still remembered with bitterness in China's historical consciousness. Even after the formal end of the opium trade and the weakening of British dominance following global shifts in power, the legacy of the unequal treaties continued to cast a shadow. It wasn't until after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 that the Chinese state formally rejected all past unequal treaties and began the process of reasserting full national sovereignty. The memory of the Opium Wars became central to China's modern identity, a symbol of what happens when national dignity is compromised by foreign exploitation. This period has been continuously referenced in Chinese political discourse, education, and culture as a call to vigilance against foreign encroachment. The story of British rule in China, therefore, is not one of conquest in the conventional sense, but of domination through economic instruments, treaties, and selective use of military power. It reveals how empires adapt their strategies to maximize control with minimal administrative burden, and how the consequences of those strategies reverberate through generations. The case of opium, both as a product and as a political tool, demonstrates the moral complexities and human costs of imperial ambition. For China, the period of British interference remains a chapter of humiliation and awakening, one that continues to influence its worldview in the modern geopolitical landscape. Winds of change, the end of empire in Africa and the Caribbean. The mid-20th century marked a transformative era in global history as the sun began to set on the once mighty European empires. Nowhere was this more evident than in Africa and the Caribbean, where the winds of change swept through colonies long held under foreign domination. The process was not sudden nor uniform. It was the result of complex interactions between global political shifts, local resistance, economic changes, and evolving cultural consciousness. By the time the 1960s arrived, the map of the world had begun to look very different, with former colonies taking bold steps towards self-governance, national identity, and sovereignty. The story of how empire came to an end in Africa and the Caribbean is one of resilience, negotiation, resistance, and, in some cases, profound turmoil. World War II had left Britain and other European powers economically drained and militarily overstretched. The war also shattered the myth of European invincibility. Soldiers from across the empire, including Africa and the Caribbean, had fought in the war, risking their lives for a cause that preached freedom while denying it at home. These veterans returned with new political awareness and a demand for dignity and equality. The global order had begun to shift, and the colonized were no longer content to remain silent. In addition to this, the newly established United Nations became a platform for expressing anti-colonial sentiment, further legitimizing the call for independence across the globe. In Africa, nationalist movements began gaining strength in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These movements were often spearheaded by charismatic leaders who articulated the dreams and frustrations of their people. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika were just a few among the many who stood at the forefront of the struggle. Political parties were formed, rallies held, and newspapers launched, each playing a role in awakening a collective sense of identity and destiny. The colonial authorities attempted to hold on to power, but the tide had turned. The costs of maintaining an empire had become increasingly untenable, and public opinion back home was also shifting toward decolonization. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from British rule in 1957. Its independence sent shockwaves through the continent and served as a model for others to follow. Nkrumah's victory was not merely political, it was deeply symbolic, proving that self-rule was achievable. Other nations soon followed. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, and Uganda in 1962. Some transitions were relatively peaceful, involving constitutional negotiations and gradual transfer of power. Others, such as Kenya and Algeria, experienced armed uprisings, where independence was achieved only after violent confrontations and significant loss of life. In the Caribbean, the path to independence was different, but no less significant. The region had long been characterized by plantation economies and a deep racial divide rooted in the legacy of slavery. Despite these challenges, a vibrant political culture began to emerge, particularly after World War II. Education levels improved, labor unions grew in strength, and local political parties gained momentum. Leaders such as Eric Williams in Trinidad and Tobago and Norman Manley in Jamaica championed the cause of self-government, pushing for constitutional reform and greater autonomy. The British, sensing the inevitability of change and wary of repeating the violent experiences of other colonies, began to grant more political rights to Caribbean territories. The formation of the West Indies Federation in 1958 was a bold attempt to unify British Caribbean territories into a single political entity. While short-lived, the Federation was a milestone in regional cooperation and laid the groundwork for future independence movements. Internal divisions, economic disparities, and differing national aspirations led to the Federation's dissolution in 1962, but the idea of self-rule remained firmly rooted. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago both achieved independence in that same year, signaling a new era for the region. Other islands followed over the next decade, each with its own timeline and challenges, but all moving steadily toward the same goal: sovereignty. The end of empire was not just a series of political milestones, it was a profound reordering of societies. Colonized people had to grapple with the dual legacies of subjugation and survival. Economies that had been structured to serve the needs of the imperial powers were ill-prepared for independence. Infrastructure, industry, and education systems had often been neglected or designed in ways that served colonial interests. New governments faced the daunting task of nation-building under difficult circumstances. They had to forge unity in diverse societies, develop economic plans, and establish institutions that could command legitimacy and deliver results. In Africa, this transition was particularly fraught. Artificial borders drawn by colonial powers had lumped together disparate ethnic and linguistic groups, often leading to post-independence tensions. Civil wars, coups, and authoritarian regimes would become recurring features in the decades that followed. Yet, despite these challenges, the spirit of independence endured. Cultural pride was rekindled, local languages and traditions were revived, and Pan-African ideals found new life in literature, music, and politics. The decolonization process may have been flawed and incomplete, but it unleashed a wave of creativity and confidence that could not be easily extinguished. In the Caribbean, post-independence societies also faced significant hurdles. Many islands remained economically dependent on former colonial powers and international financial institutions. Efforts to diversify economies and promote regional integration were met with varying degrees of success. Emigration became a major phenomenon, with many Caribbean nationals seeking better opportunities abroad. Despite these challenges, Caribbean nations carved out identities rooted in cultural expression, democratic institutions, and international engagement. The legacy of colonialism remained, but so too did a determination to move beyond it. The British Empire's retreat from Africa and the Caribbean did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader unraveling of European colonialism around the world, driven by a combination of local resistance and global pressure. The Cold War also played a role, as both the United States and the Soviet Union supported decolonization for their own strategic reasons. Britain, aware of its diminished post-war status, and eager to maintain good relations with emerging nations, often preferred to manage a peaceful transition rather than face prolonged conflict. This strategy allowed it to retain economic and diplomatic influence even after political control had ended. As independence flags rose across African capitals and Caribbean islands, the narratives of these new nations began to take shape. Writers, poets, musicians, and historians played crucial roles in documenting the journey from colonial subjugation to national pride. Education systems were reformed to reflect indigenous histories and aspirations. National holidays commemorated the struggle for freedom, and monuments were erected to honor heroes of the anti-colonial movement. In this way, the past was not erased but reinterpreted, becoming a foundation on which to build new futures. Still, the legacy of empire lingered. Economic dependencies, social inequalities, and political instability often traced their roots back to colonial structures. Former colonial powers continued to exert influence through trade agreements, military cooperation, and international institutions. In some cases, neocolonialism replaced traditional colonialism with new forms of control, replacing the old. Nonetheless, the psychological shift was real. People who had once been subjects of empire were now citizens of sovereign states, with a voice in their own affairs and a sense of collective identity rooted in shared experience. The story of decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean is ultimately one of human agency. Empires did not simply collapse under their own weight. They were challenged and dismantled by people who believed in the right to self-determination. From peaceful protests and strikes to intellectual debates and underground resistance, the fight for independence was waged on many fronts. It involved both ordinary citizens and visionary leaders, each playing their part in a long and difficult process. Their legacy lives on in the nations they helped to create, and in the continuing struggles for justice, equality, and recognition that define post-colonial societies today. The process of gaining independence brought not only hope and celebration, but also complex realities. Governments had to learn to govern without the administrative machinery of the colonial regime. This transition required developing new civil services, police forces, educational structures, and healthcare systems, all while managing limited resources and the expectations of their populations. Mistakes were inevitable, and the road ahead was never smooth. But the fact that so many nations took that step remains a powerful testament to their resilience and determination. In many ways, the winds of change that swept through Africa and the Caribbean were not merely political events. They were deeply human transformations. They represented the culmination of centuries of resistance and adaptation, of survival and assertion. Each territory had its own path, shaped by geography, history, leadership, and global context, but all shared a common aspiration, the desire to be free, to chart their own destinies, and to define themselves on their own terms. Though challenges remain to this day, the end of empire marked a profound shift in the world order, one that gave voice to millions who had long been denied one. It is this voice, clear, proud, and undeterred, that continues to echo through the ongoing struggles and achievements of post-colonial nations. The Falklands War and the illusion of imperial power. The Falklands War, fought in 1982 between the United Kingdom and Argentina, was a short but intense conflict that highlighted both the stubborn remnants of imperial ambition and the illusions still surrounding the concept of global power. At its heart, the war was a confrontation over a group of remote islands in the South Atlantic, territories sparsely populated and of limited strategic value. Yet, the emotions, national pride, and political motives bound up in the confrontation revealed deep currents of post-imperial identity, outdated geopolitical assumptions, and the fragile nature of perceived power. The islands, known as the Falklands in Britain and the Malvinas in Argentina, had long been subject to territorial disputes. While the British had administered the islands since the 1830s, Argentina had never relinquished its claim, rooted in colonial succession after independence from Spain. For many Argentinians, the islands were a symbol of unfinished sovereignty, a last vestige of colonial injustice. Conversely, for the United Kingdom, particularly during the early 1980s, the islands had become a symbol of continuity, a faint echo of the global empire it once dominated. The islands' strategic insignificance belied the emotional and political weight they carried for both nations. In Argentina, the ruling military junta faced mounting internal discontent. The economy was faltering, civil liberties were suppressed, and the brutal reality of state-led violence had left thousands missing or dead. Facing a legitimacy crisis, the junta turned to nationalism as a unifying tool. The decision to invade the Falklands was framed as a patriotic act, a righteous reclaiming of territory that rightfully belonged to Argentina. It was a calculated gamble, born out of a belief that Britain, distant and seemingly in decline, would not or could not respond forcefully. The junta misread not only Britain's capacity, but also its willingness to defend its distant territory. In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was also navigating political uncertainty. Her government had been plagued by economic challenges and unpopular policies, and her leadership faced serious scrutiny. The invasion of the Falklands offered an opportunity to reassert Britain's global standing and to rally domestic support around a common cause. Thatcher's government interpreted the Argentine move not just as an act of aggression, but as a challenge to the post-imperial dignity of Britain. In an era when the sun had long set on the British Empire, the notion of defending a remote outpost took on a symbolic importance far beyond its actual value. It became a matter of national pride, of proving that Britain remained a power to be reckoned with, even if its empire had receded into history. The British response was swift and unexpected. Within days, a naval task force was assembled and dispatched across the Atlantic. The sheer scale of the deployment surprised the Argentine leadership. Britain committed aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and thousands of troops to an operation that would test its logistical capacity and military resolve. The war, though short in duration, was marked by fierce combat and a surprising level of technological and tactical complexity. Naval battles, aerial dogfights, and grueling ground operations underscored the seriousness of the engagement. For both countries, the cost was significant, measured in lives lost, resources spent, and reputations altered. Despite the odds, British forces ultimately recaptured the islands after just over 2 months of conflict. The Argentine surrender in June 1982 marked a decisive victory for the United Kingdom and a catastrophic failure for the junta. In Britain, the war dramatically shifted public opinion and political fortunes. Thatcher's leadership, once under fire, was now lauded for its decisiveness and strength. The victory helped secure her political dominance and reshaped her image as a formidable leader. National pride surged, and for a time, the illusion of imperial potency was rekindled. Yet beneath the surface, the war also exposed the fragility of such illusions. While Britain had won militarily, the necessity of the war raised troubling questions. Was the defense of the Falklands truly about the rights of the islanders, or was it more about nostalgia for empire? Could the expense and loss be justified by national pride alone? And if Britain had to go to such lengths to defend a minor territory, what did that say about its real standing in the world? The war, far from proving enduring global influence, underscored the limitations of modern power projection. Britain had succeeded, but only just, and only with immense effort. The war also revealed the fading relevance of old imperial relationships. International reaction was mixed, and support for Britain was not universally forthcoming. While the United States provided key intelligence and logistical assistance, it also found itself balancing ties with Latin America. Many countries in the global South viewed the conflict through an anti-colonial lens, seeing Britain's actions not as righteous defense but as imperial overreach. The idea that a European power could so vigorously defend a distant colony felt increasingly out of step with global opinion. In this sense, the war underscored how much the world had changed, even if the rhetoric of imperial resolve lingered. In Argentina, the outcome was transformative in a different way. The defeat shattered the illusion of military competence and exposed the junta's reckless gamble. Public outrage surged, and the collapse of the regime followed shortly thereafter. In a bitter irony, the very war designed to unite and distract the nation instead accelerated the downfall of authoritarian rule. Democracy returned to Argentina, and the memory of the conflict became both a national trauma and a point of unresolved identity. The islands remained out of reach, yet the cause retained its emotional pull, entwined with national dignity and historical grievance. The Falklands War thus occupies a strange place in history, a modern war shaped by outdated visions. It was a war fought in the name of sovereignty and self-determination, but also steeped in the symbols and shadows of empire. For Britain, it became a brief flicker of imperial muscle, a momentary restoration of global relevance that masked deeper geopolitical decline. The victory, though real, did not change the broader arc of British foreign policy or halt the retreat from empire. For Argentina, the loss brought painful reckoning, but also the seeds of political renewal. What makes the conflict especially poignant is how much it revolved around perception. The illusion of imperial power, on both sides, played a pivotal role in how decisions were made. The Argentine junta imagined a weakened Britain clinging to outdated grandeur, while British leaders believed that assertiveness abroad would reaffirm their relevance. In reality, both nations were grappling with transitions. Argentina was facing the end of military rule. Britain was redefining its post-imperial identity. The war offered no enduring solutions, only temporary validations built on fragile ground. Decades later, the Falklands remain a point of tension, though the military confrontation has not resumed. Britain retains control, and the islanders have expressed a clear desire to remain under British governance. Still, the underlying questions persist. Sovereignty, national pride, and the legacies of empire continue to animate discourse on both sides. The war itself has become a symbol, a reminder of how quickly emotion, illusion, and politics can lead nations into conflict. It remains a cautionary tale about the costs of clinging to historical identities in a world that has moved on. Ultimately, the Falklands War did not reshape the world, but it did reveal a great deal about the fragility of power. It showed that military victory can obscure deeper truths, that nations can be seduced by symbols of the past, and that the echoes of empire still carry weight long after the empire itself has faded. In the cold logic of history, the war was unnecessary and avoidable, yet also inevitable given the passions and perceptions involved. It stands as a testament to the dangers of illusion and the enduring consequences of unresolved histories. The Commonwealth today, legacy of empire or family of nations. The Commonwealth today stands as one of the most complex and paradoxical legacies of the British Empire, a global association of states that, while rooted in a shared colonial past, aspires to redefine itself as a cooperative family of independent nations. Its identity is suspended between the shadows of historical domination and the aspirations of mutual partnership. With 56 member states spread across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Americas, Europe, and the Pacific, the Commonwealth encapsulates nearly a third of the world's population. Despite its lack of binding political authority or a unified economic policy, the organization continues to exist and evolve, largely driven by shared values, symbolic ties, and a mixture of pragmatism and nostalgia. The origins of the Commonwealth trace back to the gradual dismantling of the British Empire, particularly after the First and Second World Wars, when former colonies sought greater autonomy or outright independence. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 marked a legal recognition of dominion equality, signaling the slow transformation of empire into something more collaborative. However, the post-war decolonization wave truly tested the viability of the Commonwealth. As countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia broke free from colonial rule, they were offered the opportunity to join this new association, not as subordinates, but as sovereign states that retained a voluntary connection with Britain and with one another. Over time, the Commonwealth reinvented itself through declarations like the Singapore Declaration of 1971 and the Harare Declaration of 1991, emphasizing democratic governance, human rights, and economic development. Yet for all the aspirational language and ceremonial camaraderie, tensions have always simmered beneath the surface. The very notion of the Commonwealth invokes different meanings in different regions. For some, it is a symbol of shared history and opportunity. For others, it is a lingering reminder of exploitation, cultural erasure, and subjugation. The monarchy, as the nominal head of the Commonwealth, adds another layer to this ambiguity. Though the British monarch holds no executive power over member states and their presence is largely symbolic, their role is still a contentious issue. While some nations have comfortably retained the monarch as their ceremonial head of state, others have moved towards full republicanism, choosing to cut that final symbolic tie. In recent years, high-profile constitutional changes in countries like Barbados and growing Republican movements in Jamaica and Australia have reignited debates over the relevance of monarchy within the Commonwealth framework. These shifts are not merely symbolic. They reflect deeper questions about national identity and the enduring legacy of colonialism. At its core, the Commonwealth tries to strike a delicate balance between celebrating shared traditions and respecting individual sovereignties. Its strength lies in its diversity. Its membership ranges from highly developed nations to some of the world's poorest. This diversity, however, also poses significant challenges. With such vast disparities in economic development, governance standards, and political priorities, building consensus is often more about diplomacy than decisive action. Nonetheless, the Commonwealth has carved out certain niches where it exercises influence, particularly in promoting educational exchanges, supporting small island states, and advocating for youth development and climate action. The Commonwealth Games, often referred to as the Friendly Games, remain one of the most visible expressions of unity. While sports cannot resolve historical grievances, the event offers a rare platform where nations compete as equals. It symbolizes a space where cultural pride and shared respect coexist, albeit briefly. However, critics argue that sporting events and ceremonial meetings cannot substitute for meaningful political or economic integration. They point out that many Commonwealth nations trade more heavily with non-member states, particularly China and the United States, suggesting that the organization's relevance is more symbolic than strategic. Another domain where the Commonwealth attempts to assert relevance is in election monitoring and conflict resolution. It has sent observer missions to various member states, aiming to uphold democratic processes and mediate political disputes. Though not always successful, these efforts showcase the organization's soft power approach. Still, its limited enforcement capacity means that it often relies on persuasion rather than penalties, leaving it vulnerable to accusations of ineffectiveness when member states deviate from democratic norms. Criticism has also emerged from within member nations, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, where calls for reparations for slavery and colonial exploitation grow louder. These calls are often directed not just at the former colonizing powers, but also at the Commonwealth as a structure that has not adequately addressed the darker chapters of its shared past. The lack of a formal mechanism to reckon with historical injustices contributes to a sense of frustration. While various heads of state have acknowledged these grievances in speeches and visits, substantial policy action remains limited, revealing the gap between rhetorical gestures and tangible redress. Education remains one of the most unifying and effective instruments of the Commonwealth. Through scholarship programs like the Commonwealth Scholarship and Fellowship Plan, thousands of students from developing member countries have pursued higher education in more advanced nations. These academic ties foster professional networks and cultural exchange that last decades. Likewise, civil society organizations within the Commonwealth are often more nimble and effective than the governmental mechanisms, tackling everything from gender equality to climate resilience. These grassroots efforts help sustain the spirit of cooperation even when political momentum lags behind. The digital age has presented both challenges and opportunities for the Commonwealth. On one hand, it has enabled greater connectivity and collaboration across borders. On the other, it has exposed the inequalities that persist within and between member nations. Internet access, digital literacy, and cybersecurity vary widely, reflecting the broader economic divides. The Commonwealth has taken steps to bridge these gaps, but its initiatives often struggle against the tide of global inequality and the pull of larger, better-funded organizations like the United Nations or the World Bank. One of the more contentious aspects of modern Commonwealth dialogue is the question of who gets to define its future. Younger generations, especially in former colonies, often see the organization as irrelevant or as a relic of a past they are trying to move beyond. For them, global challenges like climate change, migration, and digital surveillance feel far more pressing than upholding a loosely defined network of post-imperial nations. Yet, ironically, these global problems may also offer the Commonwealth a renewed sense of purpose. Small island nations threatened by rising sea levels, many of them Commonwealth members, have pushed the organization to become a more vocal advocate for climate justice. This environmental urgency has the potential to galvanize collective action in ways that traditional diplomatic platitudes cannot. Despite the criticisms and the waning interest among younger populations, the Commonwealth has proven remarkably resilient. Part of this resilience lies in its flexibility. It is not bound by rigid structures or legal frameworks, allowing it to adapt its focus as global circumstances change. It is not an empire, not a political union, and not a free trade area. It is instead a voluntary association defined as much by what it is not as by what it is. Its very ambiguity allows it to survive, if not always to thrive. The Commonwealth is also uniquely positioned to facilitate dialogue among nations that might otherwise have little to do with each other. In an increasingly polarized world, such platforms are rare. The informal and non-binding nature of the organization allows for candid discussions, which, while not always resulting in policy changes, can foster trust and mutual understanding. This diplomatic utility, although understated, is not without value. It offers a quiet space for diplomacy that is not burdened by the obligations or expectations associated with more formal international alliances. Economic cooperation remains a recurring aspiration, though actual integration has been limited. The idea of a Commonwealth advantage in trade, due to shared language, legal systems, and administrative traditions, has been promoted in various forums. While trade statistics show some marginal benefits among member states, these are often overshadowed by regional agreements like the European Union, ASEAN, or African Continental Free Trade Area. The diversity within the Commonwealth, while culturally enriching, makes it difficult to build a coherent economic policy. The organization's strength may lie less in trade agreements and more in fostering the intangible connections, trust, familiarity, and shared narratives that facilitate commerce over time. Migration and diaspora connections also underscore the modern relevance of the Commonwealth. Millions of people from member countries live and work in other Commonwealth nations, creating webs of familial, cultural, and economic ties. These diasporas often serve as informal ambassadors, maintaining links that go beyond official diplomacy. From remittances to cultural festivals, the movement of people across Commonwealth borders reinforces a sense of belonging that is both personal and transnational. Looking to the future, the Commonwealth faces a decisive crossroads. If it is to remain relevant in the 21st century, it must reckon more honestly with its origins while also redefining its mission to meet contemporary needs. It cannot rely solely on the goodwill of tradition or the symbolism of pageantry. The next generation of leaders and citizens must see the Commonwealth as a meaningful platform for addressing shared concerns, not as a polite echo of imperial nostalgia. This will require courage, innovation, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Ultimately, the Commonwealth today exists in a state of negotiated tension between past and present. It is both a legacy of the empire and an attempt to transcend it. Whether it is viewed as a relic or a reinvention depends largely on perspective. For some, it remains a source of inspiration and opportunity, a framework for cooperation without coercion. For others, it is an unfinished story, a promise yet to be fulfilled, a community still finding its voice. Its future will likely be as uneven and complex as its past, shaped not by declarations, but by the lived realities of its people. In that sense, the Commonwealth is less a fixed identity and more an ongoing conversation, one that must continue to evolve if it hopes to speak meaningfully to a world in flux. The loss of America, the Revolutionary War, and its global impact. The American Revolutionary War, culminating in the loss of the 13 colonies, marked one of the most profound turning points in British imperial history. It not only reshaped the North American continent, but also sent shockwaves across the globe, altering the trajectory of empires, ideologies, and international relations. The causes of the war were deeply rooted in disputes over governance, economic policy, and Enlightenment ideals. Tensions had long simmered between Britain and its American colonies, but by the 1770s, resistance to British rule evolved into outright rebellion. Colonists opposed what they viewed as unjust taxation without representation, and British attempts to assert tighter control only inflamed the situation. From the Boston Tea Party to the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the conflict rapidly escalated into a full-scale war. The Revolutionary War unfolded as a bitter and drawn-out conflict. Although Britain possessed one of the most powerful military forces in the world, it found itself struggling to suppress a rebellion that was ideologically driven and geographically distant. The British strategy was initially focused on overwhelming military force, seeking to crush the rebellion quickly and reassert dominance. However, the sprawling landscape of the colonies, logistical challenges, and unexpected resilience of American forces under the command of George Washington complicated British efforts. Guerrilla tactics, support from local militias, and knowledge of the terrain gave the American side distinct advantages. Moreover, the political will in Britain began to falter as the war dragged on, and domestic support for the conflict declined. One of the most significant developments during the Revolutionary War was the internationalization of the conflict. The entry of France into the war on the side of the American colonies in 1778 fundamentally shifted the balance of power. French naval support proved crucial in key battles, particularly the decisive siege of Yorktown, where the British General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. Spain and the Dutch Republic also became involved against Britain, turning the war into a global confrontation. The British Empire found itself fighting not only in North America, but also defending its interests in the Caribbean, Europe, and India. The strain on British military and financial resources grew heavier with each passing year. The eventual British defeat and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 formalized the independence of the United States of America. Britain relinquished control over the 13 colonies, marking a humiliating blow to its prestige and a symbolic turning point in the age of empire. However, the global impact of this defeat extended far beyond the Atlantic. For Britain, the loss necessitated a reorientation of its imperial strategy. While the American colonies were no longer under British rule, the empire began to focus more aggressively on other territories. India, in particular, gained prominence as the new cornerstone of British ambitions, with the East India Company rapidly consolidating control over large regions of the subcontinent. Additionally, Britain turned its attention to colonization efforts in Australia, where the transportation of convicts began in 1788. The imperial gaze also intensified in Africa and Southeast Asia. The restructuring of British global interests after the American loss marked the beginning of a new phase of expansion, one that would lead to the largest empire the world had ever seen. The shock of losing America forced British policymakers to be more cautious and strategic in their future colonial endeavors, emphasizing direct control and more efficient governance. For France, involvement in the war was a double-edged sword. The support it provided to the American revolutionaries drained the French treasury and contributed to the fiscal crisis that would eventually ignite the French Revolution. The ideological success of the American Revolution also inspired radical thinkers in France, who saw in the American experience a model for challenging monarchy and privilege. The American victory emboldened movements for liberty and self-governance across the globe, sparking revolutions, insurrections, and independence movements that would ripple through the next century. In the Caribbean, the Revolutionary War unsettled existing colonial structures. British and French colonies in the region became battlegrounds, and enslaved populations began to absorb revolutionary ideas. The Haitian Revolution, which began in the 1790s, drew direct inspiration from both the American and French revolutions. It ultimately led to the first successful slave revolt, resulting in the formation of an independent nation. The ideological domino effect of the American Revolution thus extended into movements for racial and social liberation, reshaping the colonial world. The British military and naval losses during the war led to significant institutional reform. The war exposed shortcomings in British logistics, coordination, and communication. In the years that followed, there was a concerted effort to modernize the armed forces, improve supply chains, and increase intelligence capabilities. The Royal Navy, though already formidable, underwent restructuring to ensure that future global engagements could be managed more effectively. These reforms would later prove essential in conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars and in securing British dominance during the 19th century. At the same time, the American Revolution altered the philosophical landscape of governance and political rights. Enlightenment ideals, long discussed in European intellectual circles, now had a concrete example of implementation. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion of unalienable rights and government by consent, became a foundational text in political thought. Its influence spread widely, from revolutionary France to reformist circles in Latin America, and even to nascent nationalists in colonized territories. The notion that a colonial population could overthrow a powerful empire and establish a republic based on democratic principles upended traditional ideas of monarchy and colonial hierarchy. In Britain, the defeat in America prompted introspection. The political class recognized the dangers of dismissing colonial grievances and began to adopt a more conciliatory tone in dealing with other parts of the empire. In the years following the war, Britain made reforms in Canada, allowing for more representative governance in an effort to avoid a repeat of the American scenario. Though some hardliners resisted change, the loss of America remained a sobering reminder of the consequences of ignoring the demands for autonomy and justice. Meanwhile, for the newly formed United States, independence presented both opportunity and challenge. Free from British rule, the colonies now had to build a functioning national government, manage deep regional differences, and confront the question of westward expansion. The ideals of the revolution were tested almost immediately in practice, with debates over the structure of government, the rights of citizens, and the place of slavery within the new nation. Nevertheless, the success of the revolution gave the United States a powerful narrative of liberty and resilience that would shape its national identity for centuries. Economically, the war disrupted trade patterns but also accelerated new alliances. The United States began to establish commercial ties with other nations, and Britain, though no longer in control of the colonies, quickly resumed trade relations. Economic pragmatism prevailed, and both sides recognized the benefits of continuing to engage commercially. Over time, British investors and merchants re-established strong ties with the American economy, which was rapidly growing and industrializing. The American Revolutionary War also changed the nature of diplomacy. It demonstrated the importance of international alliances and the role of public opinion in foreign policy. Governments across Europe watched the war closely, analyzing not just the military outcome, but the social and ideological upheaval it represented. Monarchies feared similar uprisings within their own borders, while reformers saw in the American experiment the promise of a more just and participatory political order. In the broader context of global history, the American Revolution marked the beginning of the modern era of nation-states. It inspired not just revolts, but revolutions based on constitutions, citizenry, and legal equality. The Atlantic world entered a new age, where traditional empires increasingly had to reckon with the power of popular movements and the legitimacy of governments rooted in the will of the people. The memory of the British loss in America lingered within imperial strategy for decades. It served as a cautionary tale about the volatility of colonial rule and the power of unified resistance. It also provided a benchmark against which future rebellions and colonial movements would be measured. In places like Ireland, India, and later South Africa, the specter of American independence was never far from the minds of both colonial administrators and revolutionaries. In conclusion, the loss of America in the Revolutionary War was not just a military defeat for Britain. It was a transformative event that reshaped the global order. It compelled empires to adapt, inspired waves of revolutionary thought, and gave birth to a nation whose ideas would reverberate across the world. The war illuminated the strengths and weaknesses of the empire, the complexity of colonial relationships, and the enduring power of ideas rooted in freedom and equality. The effects of this conflict extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the very heart of global political and social change. The loss of America also deeply affected British domestic politics and society. The war exposed fissures between the ruling classes and common citizens, many of whom bore the brunt of war taxes, economic disruption, and conscription. Criticism mounted against government figures like Lord North, and a growing number of voices in Parliament began calling for reform, not only in colonial administration, but also within Britain itself. The Whigs, in particular, used the war's failure as a rallying cry to advocate for a more accountable and representative government. Though immediate changes were limited, the debates triggered by the war's aftermath laid groundwork for broader political reform movements in the 19th century, including the expansion of suffrage and parliamentary restructuring. Beyond the British Isles, the revolutionary spirit began to ripple through other colonies of European powers. In Latin America, intellectuals and military leaders closely studied the American experiment. Figures like Simón Bolívar would later cite the American example as proof that colonial rule could be successfully overturned. While the American Revolution was distinct in context and geography, its success showed colonized peoples that imperial power was not invincible. The combination of revolutionary ideals and practical victory served as a dual inspiration. It provided both the ideological framework and the motivational momentum needed to begin challenging European dominance in the Americas. In the Ottoman Empire and Qing China, the immediate effects of the American Revolution were less visible, but still notable. These empires, watching from afar, took note of the geopolitical shifts and began to consider the fragility of European alliances. Though neither directly involved in the conflict, both empires reevaluated their diplomatic positions in a world where Western colonial powers were no longer seen as monolithic or invulnerable. This awareness subtly informed future interactions, treaties, and strategies, particularly in the 19th century, as colonial pressures increased. Another important consequence of the American Revolution was the emergence of national consciousness as a political force. Before this, many subjects of empires identified primarily with their local regions, tribes, or faiths, but the concept of a unified nation composed of equal citizens pursuing collective self-determination began to gain traction. This evolution in identity was profoundly disruptive to imperial systems that relied on hierarchical, segmented rule. The American Revolution encouraged people to think of themselves as part of a larger national story, something that would dramatically influence future unification movements in Germany, Italy, and other fragmented regions. The war also altered the psychological relationship between colonies and mother countries. In the pre-revolutionary world, colonial subjects often accepted their status as distant members of a royal empire. After the revolution, however, this perception began to fracture. Colonists in British, French, Spanish, and Dutch territories began to question not only the fairness of imperial rule, but also the necessity of their connection to distant monarchies. This shift in mindset represented a crucial break from centuries of accepted governance and contributed to the long, gradual unraveling of colonial empires over the next 2 centuries. Maritime trade patterns also shifted significantly as a result of the conflict. British naval control, though not broken, was challenged during the war in ways that revealed the vulnerabilities of overextended supply lines. The emergence of American merchant vessels competing in transatlantic trade routes posed new competition for British and European traders. Furthermore, neutral nations such as Sweden and Denmark gained temporary advantages by trading with the new republic, which lacked its own large navy to enforce exclusionary economic zones. These developments encouraged a more multipolar trading world, gradually reducing the absolute control previously enjoyed by European empires. The Revolutionary War further catalyzed debates around slavery and human rights, especially in Britain. Although slavery continued in both the United States and British colonies for decades afterward, the contradiction between revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and the continued practice of human bondage became increasingly untenable. Abolitionists in Britain seized upon this hypocrisy to press their case, arguing that an empire proclaiming moral authority could not condone the enslavement of millions. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and of slavery itself in 1833 within the British Empire was partly driven by this evolving moral consciousness, a consciousness shaped by the contradiction laid bare by the American Revolution. Additionally, the war created a generation of military leaders and veterans whose experience on the battlefield influenced future global conflicts. Many of the tactics employed in the Revolutionary War, such as asymmetrical warfare, decentralized command structures, and political insurgency, became standard in later revolutionary conflicts. Leaders in anti-colonial struggles across the globe studied the strategies employed by Washington and his officers, integrating these into their own campaigns. Thus, the American Revolution became not only a moral and ideological template, but also a military guidebook for resistance. The ideological influence of the American Revolution also had profound implications for religion and secularism. The new republic, forged without a state church and committed to religious freedom, represented a departure from the dominant European model. This approach drew attention from reformers and religious minorities in Europe and the colonies alike. The First Amendment's protection of religious liberty inspired similar provisions in later constitutions around the world. For colonized societies with entrenched religious hierarchies, the American example suggested that a state could function effectively, and perhaps more justly, without being tethered to a single religious institution. Culturally, the war redefined the idea of civic participation. In Britain and other monarchies, the revolution sparked intellectual debates about citizenship, loyalty, and governance. Writers, pamphleteers, and political theorists across Europe engaged with the questions raised by American independence. What did it mean to be a citizen rather than a subject? Could loyalty to a set of principles replace loyalty to a monarch? These questions became the foundation for democratic reform movements throughout the Western world, fueling publications, political clubs, and underground organizations dedicated to reimagining governance. Even in regions far from the battlefield, the American Revolution changed the nature of colonial administration. In British-ruled India, for example, colonial authorities became increasingly wary of local dissent. Though there was little immediate rebellion, British officials in India grew more conscious of the dangers posed by mass mobilization and ideological subversion. Consequently, British rule in India became more militarized and bureaucratically rigid, as administrators sought to prevent any uprising, similar to what had occurred in the American colonies. Ironically, this tighter grip often sowed deeper resentment, laying the groundwork for future resistance movements. The Revolutionary War also had lasting environmental effects. The mobilization of troops, construction of fortifications, and disruption of agricultural cycles in the colonies led to significant ecological changes. Forests were cleared to create military roads, animals were overhunted to feed armies, and fields were left fallow or destroyed. In some areas, the environmental degradation contributed to long-term shifts in land use and agricultural patterns. While this aspect of the war is less often discussed, it remains an important dimension of its impact, particularly for the indigenous populations who relied on local ecosystems for survival. The American victory also influenced the evolution of constitutional law. The U.S. Constitution, adopted a few years after independence, incorporated concepts of separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism in ways that were both innovative and practical. These ideas would later influence constitutions in newly formed nations around the world. The adaptability and resilience of the U.S. constitutional model encouraged other revolutionary leaders to consider how they, too, might create enduring systems of governance that protected individual rights and restrained the concentration of power. Within the new American Republic, the end of the war ushered in an era of experimentation. Institutions, currency, legal systems, and educational frameworks were all built from the ground up. The former colonies now had to learn how to function as states united in common purpose, but divided in regional interest. The Articles of Confederation, initially adopted as the national framework, proved too weak to sustain a cohesive government. This led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the creation of a stronger federal system. These institutional shifts reflected the challenges of translating revolutionary ideals into workable governance. Finally, the loss of America redefined the idea of empire itself. Rather than a simple hierarchy of ruler and subject, imperial powers were forced to confront the growing expectation that legitimacy required consent. This shift did not immediately dismantle other empires, but it deeply undermined the ideological foundations upon which they stood. As revolutions continued to erupt in the 19th and 20th centuries, from South America to Africa to Southeast Asia, the memory of the American Revolution loomed large. It served as both a warning to empires and a beacon to those under imperial rule.